The sea was terribly still that summer, wearing a mask of glittering blue that hid the gathering storm. If you stood on the white chalk cliffs in the early days of that long, golden summer, the world felt almost impossibly peaceful. The breeze rolling off the English Channel was warm and sweet, carrying the scent of salt, drying seaweed, and the faint, earthy perfume of wildflowers clinging to the edge of the world. The sky was a vast, unbroken canopy of cornflower blue. It was the kind of weather made for lazy afternoons, for children splashing in the gentle surf, and for families unfolding picnic blankets on the soft, green grass. But the beaches were empty of children. And the people who stood on the cliffs were not looking down at the rolling waves. They were looking across the water. They looked toward the hazy line of the horizon, where the sky met the sea, toward a distant shore they could not quite see but knew was there. It was a narrow stretch of water. It had always been a highway of sorts, a bridge of moving tides connecting them to the rest of the world. But now, in the quiet days following the great, frantic rescue from the beaches across that water, the channel felt different. It was no longer a bridge. It was a moat. And it felt terribly, painfully narrow. There is a unique kind of silence that falls over a house when you are waiting for a knock at the door. It is a heavy silence, a breathless quiet that makes the ticking of the hallway clock sound like a heartbeat, and the creak of the floorboards sound like a shout. In that early summer, that same heavy silence fell over the entire countryside. The boys and men had come home from the water. They had returned exhausted, their uniforms stiff with dried salt and engine oil, their eyes carrying the shadows of things they did not wish to speak about. Mothers and wives had wept quietly at kitchen tables, holding hands that were still trembling. They had drawn hot baths, scrubbed the heavy woolen tunics, and watched their loved ones fall into deep, dreamless sleeps. There was profound relief in those small, terraced houses and quiet farm cottages. But as the days grew longer and the sun warmed the earth, the relief slowly gave way to a new, shared understanding. The danger had not passed. It had simply paused on the other side of the water. And so, the waiting began. It was a gentle, surreal kind of waiting, woven into the fabric of everyday life. You could see it in the way the local baker kneaded his dough in the early hours of the morning, his eyes occasionally drifting to the window, watching the stars fade into dawn. You could see it in the way neighbors lingered over their garden fences, talking in hushed voices about the weather, about the prize-winning marrows growing in the vegetable patch, while studiously avoiding the one topic that weighed on both their minds. The landscape itself began to change, wearing the quiet scars of preparation. The familiar, welcoming signposts that had guided travelers through the winding country lanes for generations were quietly taken down, leaving the crossroads bare and anonymous. It was a strange, unsettling feeling to walk down a road you had known your entire life and find that the village at the end of it no longer had a name. It was as if the country was pulling a blanket over its head, trying to blend into the rolling green hills and disappear from view. Down on the shorelines, where the soft sand met the pebble beaches, thick coils of rusted wire were unrolled. They sat incongruously against the gentle lap of the tide. Old concrete blocks were placed across the coastal roads. To the locals passing by on their bicycles, it looked less like an impenetrable fortress and more like a fragile, makeshift fence built to hold back an ocean. But they didn't complain. They simply steered their bicycles around the barriers, their baskets filled with meager groceries, and continued on their way. In the evenings, as the sun began to dip below the hills and the shadows lengthened across the fields, a new ritual took hold of the nation. It was the ritual of the blackout. Before the last light faded, mothers and fathers would move from room to room, pulling thick, heavy curtains across every window pane. They tucked the edges in tightly, ensuring not a single sliver of light could escape into the gathering dark. Inside, the houses became warm, insulated little islands. The soft yellow glow of table lamps illuminated quiet domestic scenes. A grandfather smoking a pipe by the empty fireplace. A young girl practicing her spelling words at the kitchen table. A mother sitting in an armchair, the rhythmic click-clack of her knitting needles the only sound in the room, working coarse gray wool into socks for men she would never meet. In the corner of the parlor, the wooden radio set would emit a warm, low hum. It was a comforting presence, a glowing amber dial that tethered each isolated home to millions of others across the dark countryside. They listened to the crackling music, to the calm, steady voices of the newsreaders, drawing comfort from the simple fact that the voices were still there, reading the evening bulletin just as they had the night before. Yet, even in these cozy, shuttered rooms, the quiet tension remained. If a dog barked in the distance, or if the wind rattled the window frame, the knitting needles would pause for just a fraction of a second. A breath would be caught and held. A glance would be shared across the room. And then, the steady click-clack would resume. In the upstairs bedrooms, by the faint light of a single candle shielded by a cupped hand, letters were being written. Imagine a young woman, her hair pinned back, sitting at a small wooden desk. The house is entirely silent around her. She dips her pen into the inkwell, the scratch of the nib loud in the stillness. She writes to her husband, who is stationed at a grassy airfield just a few counties away. She doesn't write about the fear that gnaws at her stomach when she looks at the empty side of the bed. She doesn't write about how she stood in the garden that afternoon, staring up at the empty blue sky until her eyes watered, wondering when the dark specks would appear. Instead, she writes about the mundane, beautiful things of life. She tells him that the roses he planted by the back gate are blooming with an unusual, fierce red this year. She tells him that the postman asked after him, that the stray cat has returned to the shed, that she has saved a little tin of peaches for when he comes home on leave. She folds the paper carefully, smoothing the creases with her thumb. She seals the envelope, sealing her quiet courage inside with it. It is a profound, everyday heroism. The heroism of carrying on, of tending the garden, of sweeping the front step, of pretending that the world is not holding its breath. And out there, in the quiet dark of the airfields, the young men receiving those letters were waiting, too. They slept in wooden huts that smelled of damp canvas, boot polish, and wet wool. They were young, some of them impossibly young, their faces still soft with childhood. They lay on narrow cots in the dark, listening to the wind sweep across the flat, grassy plains. Sometimes, they could hear the distant, comforting cough of an engine being tested in a hangar by tired, grease-stained mechanics working through the night. These young men did not feel like warriors. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the bravado of the daylight faded, they felt only the profound weight of the sky above them. They thought of their mothers pulling the blackout curtains. They thought of the white cliffs bathed in starlight. They knew, though it was rarely spoken aloud, that when the storm finally broke, it would fall upon them first. They would be the ones to rise into the cold, thin air to meet it. So, they pulled their woolen blankets up to their chins, closed their eyes against the darkness, and tried to find sleep in the fragile quiet. Outside, the country stood watch. Along the coastal paths and atop the high hills, older men in thick coats walked slowly through the dew-soaked grass. They carried simple binoculars and flasks of hot, sweet tea. They were farmers, shopkeepers, and schoolteachers, acting as the eyes and ears of a sleeping nation. They stood by the edge of the cliffs, peering out over the black expanse of the channel, listening intently to the night. The water below them gently lapped against the ancient chalk, a rhythmic, soothing sound that had shaped the island for millennia. The night breeze whispered through the tall grass, cool and damp. Above them, the stars were scattered across the heavens like spilled sugar, bright and indifferent to the worries of the world below. It was a beautiful, heartbreakingly peaceful night. Every rustle of the leaves, every distant call of a night bird, seemed magnified in the stillness. The men pulled their collars up against the chill, wrapping their hands around the warm tin of their flasks, and continued their silent vigil. They were guarding the slumber of the innocent, standing between the safety of the warm hearths behind them and the unknown darkness stretching out before them. As the deep blue of the night slowly began to soften at the edges, giving way to the pale, fragile gray of approaching dawn, the countryside remained untouched. Another night had passed in safety. The storm had not yet arrived. The sun would soon rise again, turning the white cliffs golden once more, burning the mist off the fields, and waking the villages to another day of beautiful, terrifying blue skies. Another day of ordinary people doing ordinary things with quiet, extraordinary bravery. Another day of looking across the water, feeling the warmth of the sun on their faces, and waiting, together, in the gentle, breathless shadows of the channel. Long before the sirens woke the sleeping cities, the sky was watched by weary eyes in the quiet dark. High up on the jagged, windswept edges of the coast, where the ancient chalk meets the restless sea, a silent vigil was underway. It was a watch kept not by soldiers in trenches, but by ordinary people sitting in the damp chill of the night, holding the fragile safety of a nation in their tired hands. If you were to walk along those lonely cliffs in the deep hours of the night, you might not see them at first. The landscape was swallowed by the heavy velvet of the blackout. But if you listened closely, beneath the rhythmic crashing of the waves and the sigh of the wind through the tall, salt-sprayed grass, you would hear the faint, steady hum of electricity. And if you looked carefully through the sea mist, you might catch the faintest sliver of yellow light escaping from the crack of a heavy wooden door. Inside these small, makeshift wooden huts, perched precariously on the edge of the world, sat the watchers. Many of them were young women, girls who had left behind quiet villages, bustling shops, and warm family hearths to wear the blue uniform of the auxiliary. They sat shoulder to shoulder in darkened rooms that smelled faintly of ozone, hot dust, and black coffee. The air was thick and still, a sharp contrast to the wild gales blowing just outside the thin wooden walls. Before them sat the strange, heavy machinery of this new kind of watchfulness. They wore cumbersome headphones over their ears, pressing them close to shut out the howling wind, listening to the static and the crackle of the empty ether. And in the center of the room, casting a strange, ethereal pallor across their young faces, was the soft, pulsing green glow of the cathode screen. It was a mesmerizing, hypnotic light. In the dead of night, when the rest of the country was lost in dreams, these young women stared into that small circle of glass. They watched the line of light sweep round and round, a mechanical heartbeat tracing the invisible contours of the sky. The responsibility they carried was a profound, invisible weight. They knew that a sudden spike on that glowing green line, a tiny, flickering disturbance in the sweeping light, was not just a trick of the machine. It meant shadows were moving in the clouds. It meant strangers were crossing the dark water. If they blinked, if they allowed their heavy eyelids to close for just a moment, a whisper in the sky might slip past them, and the cities behind them would have no warning. Imagine a young woman, hardly 20 years old, sitting in the gloom. Her eyes ache from the endless green glare. Her shoulders are stiff beneath her woolen tunic. She reaches a hand up to rub the back of her neck, trying to banish the fatigue that pulls at her. Beside her, a friend silently passes over a tin mug of lukewarm tea. Their fingers brush, a tiny, comforting point of human connection in a room full of cold wires and glowing glass. They share a quiet smile in the green light, a silent acknowledgement of their shared exhaustion, and turn their eyes back to the screen. In her pocket, the young woman carries a folded letter from her mother. She had read it twice before her shift began. It speaks of mundane things, of rationing, of the garden slowly yielding its summer vegetables, of the neighbor's dog. In her mind, she clings to these ordinary images. They are an anchor tying her to the world she is trying to protect. She stares into the glass, willing the sky to remain empty, offering a silent, breathless prayer for just one more quiet night. But the watch was not kept in the darkened huts alone. Further inland, scattered across the rolling green hills, atop village church towers, and nestled among the golden fields of wheat, were the open-air posts of the Observer Corps. Here, there were no glowing screens or humming wires. There was only the vast, open canopy of the night sky, and the sharp, straining eyes of men who had volunteered to stand in the cold. Many of them were older, their hair silvered by time, men who had seen the terrible face of war in their youth and had been told they were now too old to fight. But they could watch. And they could listen. They stood in small, circular sandbag pits, exposed to the elements. The night air bit at their cheeks and numbed their fingers. They wore heavy overcoats, thick scarves knitted by worried wives, and sturdy boots that stamped the wooden floorboards to keep the blood flowing. Picture two such men standing in the early hours of the morning, when the night is at its absolute darkest and the cold sinks deep into the bones. One is a local baker, the other a retired schoolteacher. In peacetime, they might only exchange a polite nod on the high street. But here, in the damp chill of the observation post, they are brothers bound by a shared, quiet purpose. They lean against the sandbags, looking up into the endless expanse of stars. Heavy brass binoculars hang from straps around their necks, cold against their chests. They speak in hushed, low tones, partly so they can listen to the sky, and partly because the vastness of the night demands a certain kind of reverence. They talk of small things to keep the sleep away. The schoolteacher speaks of the books he longs to read when the madness is over. The baker describes the warm, yeasty smell of his ovens, a memory that seems a million miles away from the damp earth and the biting wind. And then, they stop. The conversation dies mid-sentence. They hold their breath. The baker tilts his head, turning his ear toward the sea. He closes his eyes, blocking out the stars, focusing entirely on the invisible currents of the air. At first, it is nothing more than a vibration, a feeling felt deep in the chest rather than a sound heard by the ears. Then, it becomes a low, droning hum. It is a sound out of place in the sleeping countryside. It does not belong to the wind, or the sea, or the rustling leaves. It is the rhythmic, mechanical throb of distant engines, far away, hidden somewhere in the black velvet of the sky. The schoolteacher raises his heavy binoculars, slowly panning them across the stars, searching for a shadow blocking out the light. The baker reaches for the telephone beside him. There is no panic. There is no shouting. There is only a slow, deliberate movement born of countless hours of practice and a deep, settling sorrow. He turns the handle of the telephone, waits for the voice on the other end, and quietly, calmly, speaks into the receiver. He reports the sound, the direction, the feeling of the sky. In that simple, whispered phone call, the invisible relay is set into motion. The warning passes from the cold, lonely post in the field, down the copper wires, to the plotting rooms hidden deep underground. It is a gentle relay of terrible news, passed from hand to hand, voice to voice, by ordinary people doing an extraordinary thing simply by standing their ground and paying attention. As the hours drag on, the physical toll of the watch deepens. The cold becomes a dull ache in the joints. The mind plays tricks in the shadows. A low-hanging cloud looks menacing, a sudden gust of wind sounds like an approaching storm. It takes a remarkable kind of resilience to stand in the dark, hour after hour, fighting the desperate, pulling need for sleep. It is not the sudden, explosive courage of a battlefield. It is the slow, quiet courage of endurance. It is the heroism of pouring a final, half-empty cup of tea, wrapping a scarf a little tighter, and refusing to look away. When the first pale, fragile light of dawn finally begins to bleed into the eastern horizon, a collective sigh seems to ripple across the coast. The brutal blackness of the night softens into bruised purples and gentle grays. The stars fade, washing away into the approaching morning. In the radar huts, the young women stretch their aching backs, removing the heavy headphones, rubbing the red indentations from their ears. They step out of the claustrophobic darkness into the fresh, cold morning air, blinking against the rising sun. The light reveals the pale exhaustion on their faces, the dark circles beneath their eyes, but also a quiet, profound relief. They have carried the country safely through another night. Out in the fields, the older men pack away their cold binoculars and empty their thermoses. They pat the dew-soaked sandbags, a silent farewell to the post until tomorrow, and begin the slow walk back down the country lanes toward their homes. They walk past the quiet cottages where curtains are still drawn tight, past the sleeping villages that do not know how closely they were guarded. They smell the sweet wood smoke of early morning fires, the promise of a warm hearth and a soft bed. They are weary to their very souls, their eyes heavy with the accumulated weight of the night sky. But as they turn to glance back at the cliffs one last time, bathed now in the golden, forgiving light of a new day, they know they will return. When the sun sets and the shadows lengthen across the water, they will put their heavy coats back on. They will walk back out into the cold, back into the quiet, breathless dark. For as long as the storm threatens, the watchers will be there, silently holding back the night. If you looked closely at their faces, beneath the smudges of grease and the heavy shadow of exhaustion, you could still see the ghosts of the children they had been just yesterday. It was the height of a breathtakingly beautiful summer, a season so golden and warm it felt like a cruel trick played by the universe. Across the southern shires, the grass grew tall and sweet-smelling, swaying in a gentle breeze that carried the scent of clover and blooming hawthorn. Tucked away within these quiet, rolling landscapes were the airfields. From a distance, they did not look like fortresses of war. They looked like sprawling country meadows, dotted with canvas tents and wooden huts, bathed in the soft, forgiving light of a July afternoon. And the inhabitants of these meadows did not look like hardened warriors. They were, in every sense of the word, just boys. Many of them had scarcely finished their schooling. Only months before, their greatest worries had been Latin examinations, a scuffed cricket ball, or summoning the courage to ask a girl for a dance at the village hall. Their hands were used to holding fountain pens and bicycle handlebars, not the firing buttons of a fighter plane. When they laughed, which they did often, trying to chase away the heavy silence of the waiting, their voices sometimes still carried the sudden, cracking pitch of youth. They wore uniforms that often seemed just a little too large, the rough blue wool bunching at their shoulders. Around their necks, they tied soft silk scarves, some covered in polka dots, others a deep, rich burgundy, gifts from anxious mothers and sweethearts hoping to protect them from the chafing of their heavy leather flying helmets. They slouched in canvas deck chairs pulled out onto the grass, their long legs stretched out in front of them, faces tilted up toward the sun, trying to catch a few moments of sleep before the sky called them away again. If you wandered through these grassy dispersals, the sounds you heard were jarringly domestic. The scratchy, tinny melody of a jazz record playing from a portable gramophone resting on an overturned wooden crate. The gentle clinking of a teaspoon against a porcelain mug as someone stirred sugar into a lukewarm cup of tea. The soft, rhythmic thumping of a stray airfield dog wagging its tail against the side of a canvas tent, perfectly content to be surrounded by so many friendly hands willing to offer a scratch behind the ears. But beneath this illusion of a carefree summer camp, there was a profound, humming tension. It was a physical weight in the air, a quiet vibration that everyone felt but no one spoke of. You could smell it before you could see it. It was a scent that would forever be etched into the memories of those who survived, a potent, intoxicating blend of high-octane aviation fuel, the sharp tang of hot engine oil, the dusty warmth of sun-baked canvas, and the sweet, crushed meadow grass beneath heavy rubber tires. Resting at the edge of the fields were the machines. The Spitfires and the Hurricanes. They were beautiful, sweeping creations of metal and fabric, gleaming softly in the summer light. Yet, standing next to one, you felt its terrible, mechanical heaviness. They were immense, powerful beasts, smelling of heat and danger. To see a 19-year-old boy, his hair tousled by the wind, walking up to one of these massive machines and climbing onto its wing, was to witness a heartbreaking contrast. The fragility of human youth stepping into the cold, unyielding embrace of a metal shell. The hardest part, they all secretly agreed, was not the flying. It was the waiting. They spent hours in the wooden dispersal huts, waiting for the harsh, sudden ring of the telephone that would send them sprinting to their aircraft. How does a boy hold his nerve when he knows the sky is waiting to test him? They coped with a quiet, heartbreaking grace. They played endless games of cards, the worn paper edges soft from nervous, sweating fingers. They read dog-eared paperbacks, reading the same paragraph 3 or 4 times because their minds were drifting upward into the clouds. And, in the quietest corners of the room, they wrote letters. Imagine a young pilot sitting on the edge of a sagging cot. The room hums with the low murmurs of his friends, but he is a million miles away. He balances a pad of pale blue paper on his knee. He unscrews the cap of his pen, chewing thoughtlessly on the end of it for a moment, his eyes staring blankly at the wooden floorboards. He is writing to his mother. What does a boy write to his mother when he knows, deep in his heart, that this letter might be the last she ever receives from him? He does not write about the sheer, suffocating terror of diving through a cloud bank not knowing what waits on the other side. He does not write about the empty chair at the breakfast table that morning, where his best friend had sat just yesterday. He does not write about how his hands shake so badly after he lands that he has to hide them deep in his pockets so the mechanics won't see. Instead, he pours all of his love into the mundane. He lies, beautifully and bravely. "Dearest Mom," his messy, looping handwriting spells out. "The weather here is absolutely splendid. It feels more like a holiday than anything else. Please don't worry about me. I am eating well, though the tea is dreadful, nothing like yours." He pauses, smiling softly to himself. Has the cat had her kittens yet? Make sure Tommy is looking after my bicycle. I'll be wanting it when I come home on leave. And please, tell Dad I finally learned how to properly polish my boots, though he probably wouldn't believe it if he saw them. He seals the envelope, pressing the flap down with his thumb. And that small, folded piece of paper is a supreme act of everyday heroism. It is the fierce, protective instinct of a child trying to shield his parents from the dark. He hands it to the orderly with a casual smile, a quiet offering of love left behind on the solid earth. When the telephone finally rings, the illusion of the summer camp shatters. There is no shouting, no cinematic drama. There is only a sudden, synchronized explosion of movement. Chairs are pushed back, scraping against the wood. The half-read book is placed face down on the table, its pages fluttering in the sudden draft. The mug of tea is left behind, a thin wisp of steam still rising from its surface. They run out into the blinding sunlight, their heavy boots thudding against the dry earth. As they reach their aircraft, there are small, unspoken moments of profound tenderness between the boys and the ground crews. A mechanic, older, his face smeared with grease, helps a young pilot strap into the heavy, cumbersome parachute. He leans in close over the edge of the cockpit, his hand resting for just a second on the boy's shoulder. He doesn't say a word of grand encouragement. He simply pats the metal side of the fuselage, a silent, pleading gesture that says, "I fixed her for you. Now, please, bring her back." The canopy slides shut, locking the boy inside his small, glass and metal world. The engine coughs, sputters, and roars to life, a deafening sound that vibrates deep in the chest. The smell of exhaust fumes washes over the field. And then, they are moving. The graceful machines bounce awkwardly over the uneven grass, gathering speed, until the earth finally lets them go. As they climb into the vast, endless blue, a profound loneliness settles over the cockpit. The noise of the engine is a constant, deafening roar, yet the isolation is absolute. Down below, the English countryside looks like a patchwork quilt of greens and golds, peaceful and asleep. The winding rivers glitter in the sunlight. It is the home they know, the fields they played in, shrinking away beneath their wings. Up here, the air grows freezing cold. The boy pulls his leather helmet tighter, feeling the oxygen mask pressing heavy against his face. His breath sounds loud and rhythmic in his own ears. He scans the towering white cathedrals of the clouds, his eyes straining against the blinding glare of the sun. He is no longer a schoolboy worrying about exams. He is no longer the boy who left his bicycle in the shed. In the cold, thin air of the upper atmosphere, with the weight of an entire, breathless nation resting squarely on his young shoulders, he has been forced to become a guardian of the sky. But beneath the heavy leather, beneath the canvas harnesses and the terrifying roar of the engine, his heart still beats with the rapid, fragile rhythm of youth. He feels the cold knot of fear in his stomach, and he swallows it down. He grips the control column with hands that are suddenly very small against the immense machinery of war. He looks at the vast, empty sky stretching out before him, whispers a quiet word to the empty air, and steers his beautiful machine forward into the shadows, leaving his childhood on the summer grass far below. There is a particular kind of cold that belongs only to the open water just before the dawn, a damp, creeping chill that settles into the rusted iron of a ship and the tired bones of the men who sail her. Out on the restless, gray expanse of the English Channel, long lines of merchant ships pushed slowly through the water. They were not sleek, beautiful vessels of war. They were the working horses of the sea, heavy, battered freighters carrying the lifeblood of a nation. Coal, timber, wheat. Their hulls were streaked with rust, and their decks were cluttered with the humble machinery of a sailor's life. In the early hours, a thick, white mist often rolled off the coast, settling heavily over the waves. It wrapped the ships in a damp, suffocating cocoon. To the men standing watch on the bridge, staring out into the opaque whiteness, the world seemed to end just a few feet beyond the bow. Before the war, this mist had been a dreaded enemy, a blinding hazard that threatened to run them aground or send them colliding into one another in the dark. But now, in this strange and quiet summer, the mist was a beloved friend. It was a soft, white blanket drawn over them, hiding them from the eyes that they knew were searching the skies above. Deep in the belly of these ships, men worked in the sweltering heat of the engine rooms, surrounded by the deafening, rhythmic thud of the pistons. They were older men, mostly. Men with hands calloused by years of hauling ropes and faces withered by a lifetime of ocean winds. When they came up to the deck for a breath of fresh, salt air, wiping the sweat and coal dust from their foreheads with grimy handkerchiefs, they did not look out at the horizon. They looked straight up. There is a profound, helpless vulnerability to being on a slow-moving ship when danger comes from the sky. On land, a person can run. They can hide beneath a staircase, or dive into a trench, or simply lose themselves in the shadows of a forest. But on the water, there is nowhere to go. You are a dark silhouette on a glittering, flat canvas. As the morning hours stretched on, the summer sun would inevitably begin its work. The warming rays would slowly, cruelly, burn the mist away. The protective white blanket would dissolve into thin, ragged wisps, leaving the convoy entirely exposed on the sparkling, slate-gray water. The sailors would stand at the railings, their eyes narrowed against the glare, listening. Over the gentle lap of the waves and the steady churning of their own engines, they waited for a different sound. The low, menacing thrum of aircraft. When the sound finally came, it was a terrifying, resonant vibration that seemed to shake the very air around them. But sometimes, before the fear could fully take hold, the shapes that materialized from the glare of the sun brought a sudden, overwhelming wave of relief. Because high above them, soaring through the thin, cold air, were the boys of the summer sky. For the young pilots we met on the grassy airfields, flying over the channel was an entirely different experience than flying over the familiar patchwork of the English countryside. The moment their wings crossed the white line of the cliffs, leaving the green earth behind, the world changed. The air over the sea felt heavier, somehow. The sound of their engines changed pitch, echoing strangely off the vast, flat surface of the water below. There was a deep, unsettling isolation in flying out over the deep. They knew, with a quiet, unspoken dread, that if their engine were to suddenly cough and fall silent here, there would be no soft meadow to catch them. There was only the endless, unforgiving gray water, waiting to swallow them whole. They sat in their cramped, freezing cockpits, their eyes constantly scanning the vast dome of the sky, their heads turning on a swivel until their necks ached. But occasionally, they would allow themselves to look down. From their great height, the massive, lumbering merchant ships looked like tiny bath toys, leaving delicate, white trails of foam in their wake. The pilots felt a sudden, fierce surge of protectiveness for those slow, fragile shapes below. They knew what those ships carried. They knew that the men down there were relying entirely on the boys up here. It is a beautiful, fragile thing, the silent camaraderie that forms between two groups of people who can neither speak to nor hear one another. Picture a 19-year-old pilot, his hands tight on the control column, the cold air seeping through his heavy leather gloves. He looks down and sees a freighter making its painfully slow progress across the channel. On a sudden impulse, a desire to bridge the terrifying gap between the sky and the sea, he dips his wing. He brings his beautiful, roaring machine down in a sweeping arc, passing low over the ship's masts. Down on the deck, an old sailor with a pipe clenched in his teeth looks up. He sees the graceful shape of the fighter plane, the sunlight glinting off its canopy. He cannot see the face of the boy inside, but he feels the intention. The sailor takes off his grease-stained woolen cap and waves it in a wide, slow arc above his head. The pilot cannot see the waving cap, but he rocks his wings in a silent greeting before pulling back on the stick and climbing back into the lonely heights. In that fleeting second, a profound bond is forged. They are together in this vast, terrifying emptiness. The old men of the sea, and the young boys of the air, holding a shared, silent line. When the battles did come to the water, they were strange, surreal affairs. The sailors on the decks would hear the sudden, chaotic snarling of engines long before they saw anything. Then, the sky would erupt into a dizzying ballet of silver flashes and dark shadows. They watched, helpless and breathless, as the aircraft chased each other through the clouds, weaving a tangled and visible tapestry of desperate maneuvers. It looked like a distant storm, silent save for the occasional, muffled rattle of gunfire that drifted down like dry rain. The men on the ships could do little but wait. They gripped the railings, their knuckles turning white, their hearts pounding in rhythm with the distant engines. Some would murmur quiet, desperate prayers, not for themselves, but for the boys in the machine spinning above them. In the cramped quarters below deck, where the sounds of the struggle were muffled by steel and water, a young radio operator sat at his desk. The single bulb above him swung gently with the rocking of the ship, casting moving shadows across his small wooden table. He was trying to write a letter to his newborn daughter, a child he had only held once before returning to the sea. He ignored the sudden, tense shouts of the men above him. He focused on the steady, scratching sound of his pen. He wrote about the color of the water when the sun hit it just right. He wrote about the seabirds that followed the ship, crying out for scraps of bread. He wrote that he hoped she would grow up to love the ocean, even though right now, it felt like a terrifying place to be. He sealed the envelope, a small, fragile piece of hope tucked away in his breast pocket. He placed his hand over it, feeling his own heartbeat, and waited for the silence to return. Up in the freezing chaos of the sky, the young pilots were fighting a different kind of terror. They were dancing on the very edge of the atmosphere, their breath fogging the cold glass of their canopies, their muscles screaming with the effort of throwing their heavy machines through the air. They fought not with hatred, but with a desperate, frantic need to protect the slow-moving ships below, and to somehow, against all odds, make it back to the green fields of home. When the shadows finally retreated, melting back into the haze of the distant coast, a heavy, exhausted quiet would fall over the channel once more. The sailors would watch the returning fighters, counting the silhouettes as they limped back toward the land. Sometimes, a plane would fly lower than the rest, its engine sputtering, trailing a thin ribbon of dark smoke. The men on the ships would hold their breath, their eyes following the wounded bird until it safely crossed the white line of the cliffs, vanishing back into the embrace of the English countryside. As evening approached, the sky would bruise into deep purples and soft, fiery oranges. The sea would calm, turning from slate gray to a dark, glittering black. The convoy, having survived another day in the open, would slowly begin to funnel into the protected waters of an estuary or a deep water harbor. The heavy iron anchors would finally be let go, plunging into the water with a deafening rattle of chain. The engines, which had throbbed ceaselessly for days, would finally be stilled. A profound, enveloping relief would wash over the weary crews. They would lean against the cool metal bulkheads, lighting cigarettes with trembling hands, the orange glow illuminating their exhausted, soot-stained faces in the gathering dark. They were safe. For tonight, they were safe. And miles away, in the quiet, darkened wooden huts of the grassy airfields, the young pilots were also falling into exhausted, dreamless sleeps. Their flying suits were hung on the ends of their cots, smelling of sweat and fear. They did not know the names of the sailors they had protected. The sailors did not know the names of the boys who had guarded their skies. But as the stars came out, blanketing the country in a peaceful, indifferent light, they were united by a shared, quiet survival. They had held the line over the cold, gray water. And they knew, as the night deepened and the wind swept across the silent channel, that tomorrow they would wake up and do it all again. For the sea and the sky demanded it, and there was no one else to stand in the mist but them. The morning air tasted of dust and dry grass, heavy with a quiet promise that the long, breathless waiting was finally over. It was mid-August, and the English summer had ripened into a deep, golden warmth. The kind of warmth that makes the air shimmer above the country lanes and slows the pace of the world to a gentle, drowsy crawl. For weeks, the people of the southern counties had lived in a state of suspended animation. They had listened to the distant, muffled thunder over the channel. They had watched the boys in their beautiful machines climb into the blue, disappearing into the haze. But the war had remained a neighbor, a storm hovering just off the coast, threatening but not quite touching the heart of the land. Then came the day they called the Day of the Eagle. It did not begin with a sudden crash or a blinding flash of light. It began with the slow, ordinary rhythm of a Tuesday morning. In the quiet villages nestled in the valleys, back doors swung open, letting in the sweet smell of dew-soaked earth. Kettles were placed on iron stoves, beginning their slow, comforting whistle. Picture a woman stepping out into her narrow garden, a woven basket of damp laundry resting on her hip. She is surrounded by the familiar, untidy beauty of her own life, the climbing roses sprawling over the wooden trellis, the neat rows of runner beans, the soft hum of bumblebees moving sleepily from flower to flower. She sets the basket down on the grass and begins to pin white cotton sheets to the line. The fabric snaps faintly in the gentle breeze. It is a moment of profound, simple peace. But as she reaches for another wooden peg, she pauses. She does not hear anything yet, not with her ears. She feels it. A subtle, unfamiliar vibration traveling through the soft soles of her shoes, rising from the earth itself. It is a deep, resonant trembling, as if the ground is shivering in its sleep. She lowers her arms. The white sheet falls still against her dress. She turns her face toward the south, toward the coast, and she listens. Miles away, on the sprawling, sun-baked grass of the fighter airfields, the ground crews were already deep into their weary routines. These were the men and women who lived in the shadow of the great machines, their hands forever stained with black grease and smelling of high-octane fuel. They did not wear silk scarves, and they did not fly into the sun. They stayed tethered to the earth, nursing the wounded metal birds back to health. Under the shade of a camouflage net, a young mechanic sat on an overturned wooden crate. He was scarcely older than the pilots he served, but his eyes carried a heavy, quiet exhaustion. He was carefully wiping down a heavy iron wrench with a rag, his movements slow and methodical. Beside him rested a Hurricane, its engine cowling removed, exposing the intricate, tangled heart of the machine. He knew every wire, every bolt, every gentle quirk of this airplane. He cared for it with the tender devotion of a father tending to a sleeping child. In his breast pocket, safe from the oil and the dust, he carried a small, folded note from his wife. It was just a few lines, written in pencil, telling him that the baby had finally learned to sleep through the night. He had read it perhaps 10 times since dawn, finding in those simple words a tether to a world that made sense, a world that was soft and safe. He stopped wiping the wrench. He, too, felt the vibration. The loose canvas of the camouflage net above him gave a sudden, strange flutter, as if a great, invisible sigh had passed over the airfield. He stood up, the rag falling from his hands. Around him, other mechanics, fitters, and armorers were doing the same. Tools were lowered. Conversations faded into a hush. The familiar, comforting noises of the airfield, the clatter of metal, the distant barking of a dog, the laughter from the mess tent, were swallowed by a new sound. It started as a low, throbbing hum, drifting over the rolling hills like a swarm of angry bees entirely too far away to see. But it grew. It grew with a steady, terrifying inevitability, expanding until it seemed to fill the entire dome of the sky. It was not the sound of a skirmish. It was the sound of an armada. It was the sound of the shadow finally crossing the threshold. Back in the village garden, the woman shaded her eyes with a trembling hand, looking up into the glaring, hazy blue. And then, she saw them. At first, they looked like a flock of starlings caught in the high currents of the wind. Tiny, dark specks moving in perfect, unnatural formations. But there were so many of them. Hundreds of them, stretching across the horizon, a dark tide rolling over the white cliffs and spilling into the peaceful English sky. The sheer scale of it was something the human mind struggled to comprehend. It was a surreal, heartbreaking sight, the terrible machinery of destruction moving with a slow, almost graceful majesty against the canvas of a perfect summer morning. There was no panic in the garden. There was only a quiet, breathless awe. The woman reached out, her fingers finding the damp, reassuring edge of the cotton sheet on the line. She held onto it tightly, anchoring herself to the ground as the world above her changed forever. The shadow of the great fleet passed over the sun, and for a fleeting, chilling moment, the bright morning dimmed, casting a strange, twilight pall over the roses and the runner beans. On the airfields, the trance was broken by the sharp, piercing scream of the scramble bell. It was a sound that shattered the heavy air, sending a jolt of pure adrenaline through the wearied bodies of the men. Suddenly, the grassy meadows erupted into a frantic, choreographed dance. The boys in blue ran from the dispersal huts, their heavy boots pounding against the dry earth, parachutes bouncing against their legs. The young mechanic was already at the wing of his Hurricane. He helped the pilot, a boy whose face was pale and taut with a sudden, overwhelming realization, clamber into the narrow cockpit. He helped strap him in, pulling the heavy canvas harnesses tight across his chest. For a split second, their eyes met. There was no need for grand words or dramatic farewells. The mechanic simply patted the pilot's shoulder, a firm, reassuring touch that carried all the unspoken hopes of the earthbound. "I have done all I can," the touch said. "Now, it is up to you. Come back to us." He jumped down from the wing as the great engine roared to life, kicking up a storm of dust and loose grass. He watched, shielding his face with his arm, as the fighter bounced across the uneven field and lifted into the air, joining the desperate, frantic scramble to meet the overwhelming tide. When the planes were gone, a terrifying quiet fell over the airfield once more. But it was a different kind of quiet. It was the silence of a house just before the roof caves in. The mechanics, the radio operators, the young women of the WWII, all stood looking up at the sky, tracing the invisible lines of the gathering storm. They knew the target was not just the cities. The target was them. When the first distant thuds echoed across the hills, a new reality settled into the bones of the country. The war had arrived at their doorsteps. The sirens began their mournful, undulating wail, a lonely symphony rising from the towns and rolling across the valleys. In the villages, people did not run screaming through the streets. They moved with a quiet, solemn purpose. Mothers gathered their children, their hands warm and steady, leading them down into the damp, dark safety of the Anderson shelters buried in the gardens. They carried small, precious things, a favorite teddy bear, a tin of biscuits, a thermos of sweet tea, a woolen blanket. Inside the small, corrugated iron caves, they sat close together in the gloom. The smell of cold earth and damp metal surrounded them. A mother would pull her child onto her lap, wrapping her arms tightly around small shoulders, pressing her chin to the top of a soft head. As the ground above them began to shake, as the deep, terrifying thumps of falling bombs shook dust from the ceiling, she would murmur soft, meaningless words of comfort. She would hum a gentle lullaby, her voice vibrating against the child's ear, drowning out the roar of the crumbling world above. It was a fierce, private sanctuary of love in the midst of unimaginable chaos. Back on the airfields, there were no deep shelters for the ground crews. They huddled in shallow slit trenches dug into the chalky soil, pressing themselves flat against the earth as the sky tore itself apart. The young mechanic lay in the dirt, his hands covering his head. The noise was a physical weight, a deafening roar that seemed to vibrate in his teeth and his bones. He tasted the dry chalk dust in his mouth. He felt the terrifying heat of explosions rolling across the grass. In the darkness behind his tightly closed eyes, he thought of the folded note in his pocket. He thought of his wife, of his child sleeping safely in a quiet room far away. He clung to that image, a tiny point of light in the overwhelming dark, letting it anchor his racing heart. He felt a hand grasp his shoulder in the trench. It was an older fitter, a man who rarely spoke. They did not look at each other, but the firm, steady pressure of that hand was a lifeline. It was a silent promise that he was not alone in the dark, that they would endure this shattering of their world together. For what felt like an eternity, the day of the eagle raged above them. The sky, once a canvas of peaceful blue, became a tangled, chaotic web of white contrails, black smoke, and the terrifying, breathless screams of diving machines. But all storms, no matter how vast, eventually run out of rain. As the late afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the battered landscape, the deafening roar slowly began to recede. The dark tide of the Armada turned, melting back into the hazy distance over the channel, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. Slowly, cautiously, the people emerged from the earth. In the villages, the women pushed open the heavy wooden doors of their shelters, blinking against the slanting, golden light. They brushed the dirt from their skirts and looked around. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning timber and dust, but the world was still there. The runner beings still clung to their poles. The white sheets on the line, though dusted with ash, still moved gently in the evening breeze. On the airfields, the mechanics climbed out of their trenches, their faces coated in white chalk and streaked with sweat. They looked out over the cratered grass, at the smoking ruins of wooden hangars, and then they looked up. They waited for the boys to come home. As the evening sky softened into deep purples and gentle grays, the survivors landed. They taxied their exhausted machines across the broken ground, the engines sputtering and ticking as they cooled. The young mechanic walked up to his Hurricane. Its metal skin was scarred, its fabric torn, but it had returned. The pilot slid the canopy back and pulled off his leather helmet. His face was a mask of sheer, unimaginable fatigue, his eyes hollow and dark. The mechanic did not ask how it was. He did not ask how many were lost. He simply reached up, offering his hand, and helped the young boy climb down from the wing. They stood together on the torn earth, bathed in the fading light, two ordinary people who had just survived the end of the world. The day of the eagle had passed. The innocence of the summer was gone, blown away on the wind and the smoke. They all knew, as they walked slowly back toward the ruined dispersal huts, that tomorrow the sky would darken again. The great trial had only just begun. But as the first stars pricked through the bruised canopy of the twilight, a gentle, soothing night began to blanket the weary country. They had stood beneath the shadow, they had felt the earth shake, and they had not broken. They found their cots, they closed their tired eyes, and they allowed the quiet, forgiving dark to cradle them, gathering their quiet strength for whatever the dawn might bring. Even the earth itself began to carry the heavy, dusty wounds of that endless summer. If you had walked across the airfields just a few months before, you would have found only the quiet, unbroken beauty of the English countryside. There were sprawling meadows of soft, sweet-smelling grass, where the morning dew clung to the clover and the only sounds were the trilling of skylarks and the gentle rustle of the wind. They were places of peace. But as the long, heavy days wore on, these green sanctuaries began to change. The war had come down from the clouds and touched the ground. The fields were no longer smooth. They were marked by deep, jagged craters, where the dark, fertile soil and the stark white chalk beneath had been violently thrown up into the sunlight. From above, they looked like ragged scars carved into the gentle face of the landscape. This was the home of the ground crews. And as their home was broken, they simply picked up the pieces with tired, grease-stained hands and quietly put it back together. To understand the heart of this time, you must look away from the romantic, sweeping arcs of the fighter planes in the sky and look down at the men and women standing in the dust. You must look at the mechanics, the fitters, the armorers, and the riggers. They did not wear silk scarves. They wore heavy, oil-soaked overalls that grew stiff with dirt and sweat. Their hands were a roadmap of tiny cuts, dark bruises, and calluses, hands that were permanently stained with black grease that no amount of scrubbing with harsh soap could ever fully wash away. They carried the scent of their world with them, a potent, lingering perfume of high-octane fuel, hot engine oil, scorched metal, and dried earth. Their exhaustion was not a passing feeling. It was a physical weight they wore draped over their shoulders, a heavy blanket that pulled at their eyelids and made their bones ache. They worked from the first pale light of dawn until the stars were bright in the night sky, and sometimes they worked right through the dark, guided only by the dim, hooded glow of a single flashlight. Imagine a young mechanic standing beneath the wing of a fighter that has just limped home. The metal engine cowling is ticking as it cools, radiating a fierce heat that shimmers in the air. The plane is wounded. Its elegant metal skin is punctured, and the canvas fabric of its wings hangs in torn, ragged strips, fluttering sadly in the breeze. The mechanic does not despair. He simply sighs, a soft, tired sound, and reaches for his tools. He moves with a slow, practiced grace born of endless repetition. He and his mates gather around the broken machine like anxious parents around a feverish child. They bring out large squares of fresh canvas, heavy needles, and thick thread. With quiet, methodical patience, they stitch the torn fabric back together. It is strangely delicate work for such rough hands. It looks like the mending of a giant, battered quilt. Once the fabric is sewn, they paint it with a harsh-smelling chemical called dope, which tightens the canvas drumtaut as it dries in the sun. They wipe away the leaking oil, they tighten the loosened bolts, they softly pat the metal fuselage. They know that the boy who flies this machine is sleeping in a chair just a few hundred yards away, tossing restlessly in his dreams. They know that when the bell rings again, his life will depend entirely on the strength of their stitches and the tightness of their bolts. And so, they do not stop. Sometimes, the exhaustion would simply overtake them. You would see a young man, scarcely out of his teens, fall asleep sitting on the grass, his back resting against the massive rubber tire of a landing gear, a heavy iron spanner still loosely clutched in his resting hand. His head would nod forward, his breathing slow and deep. And in these moments, you would see the profound, quiet kindness that existed in the shadows of the airfield. An older fitter, his hair gray beneath his cap, would walk over. He wouldn't wake the sleeping boy. Instead, he would gently take the spanner from the loose fingers, drape a heavy woolen jacket over the boy's shoulders to keep the evening chill away, and quietly finish the work himself. It was a silent, beautiful devotion. They were not just repairing machines, they were fiercely protecting their own. But the mechanics were not alone on the scarred green earth. Hidden away on the edges of the airfields, sometimes in simple wooden huts surrounded by walls of sandbags, and sometimes in rooms buried deep beneath the ground, were the young women of the auxiliary. The air in their rooms was entirely different. It was stale and warm, smelling of ozone, hot radio tubes, and endless cups of heavily sugared tea. The light was often dim, casting long, soft shadows against the wooden walls. In the center of these rooms sat the large plotting tables, maps of the coastline spread out like a colorful, intricately drawn board game. The young women who stood around these tables held the fate of the skies in their hands. They wore heavy headsets that pressed against their ears, listening to the crackling static of the radio waves. They moved small wooden blocks across the map with long sticks, sweeping them gently over the painted blue sea and the green land, tracing the invisible paths of the plains above. There was a mesmerizing, rhythmic calm to their work. Even when the skies were chaotic, even when the radio crackled with the breathless, frightened voices of young men lost in the clouds, the women on the ground remained an anchor of absolute serenity. Picture a young woman sitting at a radio console. Her eyes are dark with fatigue. She has been on shift for 10 hours, and the heavy Bakelite headset aches against her temples. Through the static, she hears the voice of a pilot. He is alone. His compass is broken, he is surrounded by thick, blinding white clouds, and his fuel is running dangerously low. His voice trembles, just a fraction, betraying the terrible fear of a boy who believes he might simply vanish into the gray. The young woman sits up a little straighter. She presses the microphone close to her lips. When she speaks, her voice is a marvel of human resilience. It is low, smooth, and incredibly gentle. It is the voice of a sister, a mother, a friend. She does not tell him she is frightened for him. She looks at the map, calculates the headings, and speaks into the void. She gives him his numbers, her tone perfectly even, wrapping her words around him like a warm embrace. She becomes his eyes. She becomes his lighthouse. She talks to him about the weather, about the cup of tea waiting for him in the mess, keeping him tethered to the earth with the simple, soothing sound of her voice. And when she finally hears the distant, coughing roar of his engine returning to the field, she allows herself a tiny, private smile in the dim light before turning her attention to the next lost soul in the static. As the summer deepened, the danger moved from the skies directly to the ground. The airfields themselves became the targets. The warning would come as a mournful wail cutting through the humid afternoon air. But the men and women on the airfields could not simply run away. This was their home. When the earth began to shake, the mechanics would throw themselves flat against the grass, pressing their faces into the sweet-smelling soil, their hands covering the backs of their necks. They felt the concussions rolling through the ground, a deep, terrifying vibration that rattled their teeth and squeezed the breath from their lungs. In the plotting rooms and the radio huts, the women did not leave their posts. They sat at their tables and their consoles as the wooden walls trembled around them. The noise outside was a deafening roar, but inside, they maintained their hushed, steady discipline. As the ground above them was torn apart, fine, white chalk dust would loosen from the ceilings. It fell through the air like a gentle, dry snow. It settled in their hair, turning their dark curls prematurely white. It dusted the shoulders of their blue uniforms. It coated the colorful maps on the tables, muting the greens and the blues beneath a pale, ghostly layer of dust. But they did not stop moving the wooden blocks. They simply brushed the chalk from their maps with the backs of their hands, leaned closer to their microphones, and kept speaking their soothing numbers into the dark. When the terrible noise finally passed, and the heavy silence returned, the doors of the shelters and the huts would open. They stepped out into a changed world. The air was thick with smoke and suspended dust, turning the sunlight a strange, bruised orange. The green grass was buried under mounds of white chalk. Buildings were splintered, and the familiar pathways were gone. Yet, there was no wailing. There was only a profound, quiet resilience. They coughed the dust from their lungs, wiped their eyes, and immediately went to work. The mechanics picked up their shovels. Alongside the pilots, the cooks, and the clerks, they began to fill the craters. They shoveled the earth and the chalk back into the wounds of the field, stamping it down with their heavy boots, desperate to make a smooth path for the returning planes to land. And in the midst of this dusty, exhausted labor, a small miracle of ordinary life would appear. The kitchen staff would arrive, carrying heavy, sloshing urns of hot tea and thick slices of bread spread with margarine. Men and women coated from head to toe in white dust would gather around, their hands trembling slightly as they wrapped their fingers around the warm tin mugs. They stood in the ruins of their home, surrounded by the smell of burning timber, and they drank their tea. They shared quiet, tired smiles. Someone would make a gentle, understated joke about the mess, and a soft ripple of laughter would pass through the group. It was the purest form of defiance. The world was breaking apart around them, but they would not let it break them. Later that evening, when the sun finally sank below the horizon and the cool night air brought a merciful relief, a young WAAF might sit on a sandbag outside her barracks. She has finally washed the chalk from her face, though her hair still smells faintly of smoke. By the light of a small, shielded torch, she rests a pad of paper on her knee and begins a letter to her family. She thinks of the terrifying roar, the shaking earth, the dust falling like snow. She thinks of the crater that used to be the rose garden outside the mess hall. And then, she places her pen on the paper and writes. She writes that the weather was a bit gloomy today. She writes that they are all working very hard, but that the girls in her hut are lovely. She writes that she hopes the dog is behaving himself, and that she is longing for a slice of her mother's plum cake. She folds the letter, sealing all her fears away inside the envelope, choosing instead to send only love and comfort back into the world. Out on the field, beneath the vast, starry sky, the patched and mended aircraft stand in the dark. They are bruised and battered, wearing their canvas bandages and their newly tightened bolts. Beside them, the mechanics are finally wiping their hands on oily rags, their long day at an end. The scars on the green earth are still there, hidden by the night. But the field still holds. And as the exhausted men and women finally close their eyes, sinking into the deep, heavy sleep of those who have given everything they have, the quiet earth beneath them seems to breathe a sigh of relief. The grass will eventually grow back over the chalk. The wounds will heal. Because the hands that tend this earth, and the hearts that guard it, are made of something far stronger than the storm. Time used to be kept by the gentle chiming of the church clock across the square, but that summer, the sky learned to sing a much darker song. Before the world turned upside down, a day was measured in beautifully ordinary increments. It was marked by the clatter of the milkman's cart in the early dawn, the shrill whistle of the postman, the distant ringing of a school bell, and the soft, familiar click of the front gate as husbands and fathers returned home in the fading evening light. Time belonged to the people. It was a quiet, domestic rhythm, steady and reassuring. But as the leaves on the trees began to turn, taking on the bruised, golden hues of late summer, that rhythm was entirely unspooled. A new sound drifted over the rooftops and wound its way through the narrow, cobbled streets. It was a mechanical wail, rising and falling in a slow, undulating breath. It started as a low, ominous groan in the belly of the city, climbing higher and higher until it became a piercing, mournful cry, only to slide back down into a heavy, metallic sigh. It was the air raid siren. Very quickly, this haunting melody became the new clock by which millions of lives were governed. You no longer arranged to meet a friend at 3:30, you simply hoped to see them before the warning sounded. You did not plan your supper for 6 o'clock, you ate when the sky was quiet. The wail of the siren was a strange, terrible conductor, dictating the sudden stopping and starting of a million ordinary lives. Yet, human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures. What at first brought a sudden, icy shock to the heart slowly transformed into a familiar, weary cue. When the siren began its rising song, the panic of the early days was replaced by a quiet, practiced choreography. In homes across the country, a familiar routine unfolded. The kettle, if it was boiling, was quickly taken off the stove. The heavy blackout curtains were checked one last time, smoothed down at the edges to ensure not a single sliver of light betrayed their home. By the front door of almost every house sat a small, battered suitcase or a woven shopping bag. Inside were the fragile necessities of survival. A thermos flask filled with hot, sweet tea. A tin of boiled sweets. A deck of cards with worn edges. A knitting bag softly bulging with coarse wool. And, perhaps most importantly, a heavy, woolen blanket, smelling faintly of mothballs and cedar, ready to ward off the damp chill of the earth. Mothers would calmly button up their children's coats, their hands steady, even if their hearts were fluttering like trapped birds against their ribs. They would press a small, square gas mask box over young shoulders, whispering gentle, distracting words about the adventure they were going to have beneath the garden. Out on the pavement, the scene was not one of cinematic terror, but of a surreal, quiet migration. Neighbors who, in peacetime, might have only exchanged a polite nod over the garden fence, now found themselves walking shoulder to shoulder in the twilight. They stepped out into the cooling evening air, carrying their pillows and their thermoses, moving with a weary, dignified procession toward the shelters. Some walked to the small, corrugated iron Anderson shelters half buried in the soil of their own back gardens. Others walked toward the larger, communal brick shelters built on street corners. And in the great, sprawling city, thousands descended the long, curving escalators into the deep, cavernous tiled tunnels of the underground. To step into a public shelter was to cross the threshold into a completely different world. It smelled of damp brick, stale tobacco, strong peppermint, and the wet wool of 100 damp overcoats. The air was thick and close, warmed by the sheer, pressing proximity of so many human bodies. The light was usually dim, provided by a few bare bulbs caged in wire, casting long, deeply etched shadows across the faces of the gathered crowd. In these subterranean rooms, the rigid, invisible walls that had forever divided society simply melted away in the damp air. Picture an elderly gentleman sitting on a narrow wooden bench. In the world above, he is a bank manager, a man of strict routines and starched collars. But here, he is wearing a pair of worn tartan slippers, having been caught halfway through his evening routine by the siren. Next to him sits a young, exhausted woman who works in a munitions factory, her hands stained yellow from the chemicals, a sleeping toddler heavy across her lap. In the daylight, they would never share a conversation. But here, beneath the vibrating earth, the banker looks at the sleeping child. He reaches into the deep pocket of his wool overcoat, pulls out a single, perfectly wrapped toffee, and places it gently into the mother's hand with a soft, crinkling sound. He offers a polite, silent nod. The mother smiles, a genuine, tired expression of gratitude, and slips the sweet into her pocket. This was the strange, beautiful symphony of the shelters. It was not a symphony of music, but a symphony of small, profound kindnesses. When the dull, rhythmic thudding began far above them, signaling that the storm had arrived, the atmosphere in the shelter would shift. The casual chatter would drop to a hushed, reverent whisper. Eyes would instinctively glance upward at the arched brick ceiling, watching the fine dust dance in the dim light with every distant concussion. To drown out the terrifying noises of the world breaking apart above, the people below created their own, soothing countermelody. From a corner of the room, the soft, rhythmic click-clack of knitting needles provided a steady, domestic drumbeat. A woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun was working furiously on a gray sock, her eyes closed, finding peace in the repetitive motion of her hands. Somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a thermos was uncorked. The sweet, metallic smell of hot tea wafted through the stale air. It was poured into a single, chipped enamel mug and passed from hand to hand. An elderly woman took a sip, warming her cold fingers against the tin, and then passed it to a young soldier on leave, who took a sip and passed it to a stranger beside him. It was a holy communion of shared survival, an unspoken promise that they were all in this dark place together. Sometimes, a low voice would begin to sing. It was never a loud, boisterous song. It was usually a hymn, or a gentle music hall tune from 20 years ago, sung in a soft, wavering vibrato. Slowly, tentatively, other voices would join in the dark. The factory worker, the banker, the tired mother, the frightened child. They blended their voices together, creating a soft, human blanket of sound that wrapped around them, insulating them from the terrible, mechanical thunder rolling through the earth above. In a quiet corner, shielded from the main thoroughfare of the shelter, a young woman sat with her knees pulled up to her chest, resting a pad of pale paper on them. She held a small, silver flashlight between her teeth, directing its narrow beam onto the page as she wrote to her husband, who was stationed far away on a windy airfield. The shelter was crowded, the air was poor, and her back ached from the hard brick wall, but you would never know it from the words she let flow from her pen. She writes with a delicate, sweeping script. She tells him about the funny dog that someone brought into the shelter, a scruffy terrier that has spent the last hour insisting on being petted by every single person in the room. She writes about the taste of the peppermint someone offered her, and how surprisingly warm it is down here despite the chill outside. She does not tell him that she jumped when the last bomb fell, or that she is terribly, deeply afraid she might not see the morning. She swallows that fear, pushing it down into the dark, and instead fills the page with light. She tells him she loves him, that the neighborhood is standing strong, and that he is not to worry about her for a single second. She folds the paper, slipping it into an envelope, sealing a supreme act of quiet, everyday heroism in the dim, dusty light. Hours would pass in this suspended state. The shelter became a waiting room at the edge of the world, a place where time stretched and warped until it felt like they had lived underground for a lifetime. And then, finally, the melody of the sky would change. The siren would wake again, but this time, it did not wail. It sang a single, continuous, flat note. It was the all-clear. To the weary ears of the people huddled in the damp, it was the most beautiful sound in the entire world. It was a long, sustained exhale from the lungs of the city, a promise that the shadow had passed and the sky belonged to them once more. The stirring in the shelter was slow and groggy. Blankets were shaken out, sending new clouds of dust into the air. Thermoses were tightly capped. Sleeping children were hoisted onto stiff, aching shoulders. The procession back up to the surface was always a moment of profound, held breath. They climbed the stairs or the escalators, walking toward the faint, gray light of the dawn, not knowing what they would find when they emerged. When they stepped out onto the pavement, the air was always shockingly cold and smelled of pulverized brick, plaster, and wood smoke. The streets were often covered in a dusting of debris, and sometimes a familiar building was simply gone, replaced by a jagged, smoking absence in the row of houses. But the people did not collapse in despair. They stood on the pavement, blinking in the pale morning light, and looked at one another. The banker in his slippers nodded to the factory worker. The woman with the knitting smiled at the mother. They shared a look of profound, silent acknowledgement. They had survived another night. The sun was rising, casting a gentle, forgiving golden light over the broken masonry and the dusty streets. Soon, the sound of sweeping would begin. The rhythmic swish of stiff bristle brooms against the pavement, clearing away the glass and the dust. The milkman would appear, his horse carefully stepping over the rubble, delivering glass bottles to doorsteps that had miraculously survived. The kettles would be placed back on the stoves, and the sweet, defiant smell of morning tea would rise over the city. The bombs had been sent to break the spirit of the people, to shatter them into a million frightened pieces. But as the neighbors shared their tea on the swept front steps, offering a comforting hand to those who had lost something in the night, it became clear that the dark had failed. The symphony of sirens had not driven them apart. It had forced them together, down into the warm, damp earth, where they discovered that the quiet, everyday love of ordinary people is a fortress stronger than any wall of stone. And as the morning grew bright, they simply took a breath, held their heads high, and waited for the clock to start again. There was a time when the summer sun, once a gentle and familiar friend, became the heaviest burden a boy could carry. As the long, golden days of that endless summer stretched on, the beautiful weather began to feel less like a blessing and more like a gentle, relentless trap. In peacetime, a cloudless, brilliant blue sky was an invitation to lay in the tall grass, to close your eyes, and to let the warmth wash over your face. But for the young men living on the grassy airfields, the endless blue was a vast, terrifying canvas. It meant there was nowhere to hide. It meant the day would be very, very long. When we think of courage, we often picture a single, blinding moment of action. We imagine a sudden burst of bravery in the face of sudden danger. But there is another kind of courage, one that is far quieter, far heavier, and infinitely more profound. It is the courage of endurance. It is the quiet heroism of waking up, already bone-tired, and choosing to walk back out into the light. For the boys of the summer sky, the days began in the fragile, bruised hours before dawn. Imagine a small, wooden room, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and lingering cigarette smoke. In the dark, a hand reaches out from beneath a rough woolen blanket, blindly searching for the loud, jarring alarm clock to silence its ringing. The boy in the narrow cot does not leap out of bed. He lies there for a moment, staring at the ceiling he cannot see, feeling a profound, aching reluctance in every muscle of his body. He is so tired that his bones feel like they are made of lead. His eyes are raw and stinging, heavy with a desperate, pulling need for just one more hour of sleep. But he throws the blanket back. He swings his legs over the side of the cot, his bare feet touching the cold wooden floorboards. In the dim light, he slowly pulls on his uniform. It feels stiff and heavy. Everything feels heavy. When they walked out to the dispersal huts in the early morning mist, the grass soaking the hems of their trousers, they did not speak much. The cheerful banter of the early summer had slowly faded, replaced by a shared, companionable silence. They were preserving their energy, hoarding it like a precious, vanishing resource. By the time the sun had fully crested the horizon, burning away the morning mist and revealing the stark, glaring blue, they had often already been in the air and returned. And the day had only just begun. The hardest part of those days was the sheer, unrelenting repetition. You fly. You fight. You survive. You land. And then, as you taxi your beautiful, battered machine back onto the grass, your hands shaking as you pull back the throttle, you see the ground crews running toward you. They do not tell you to rest. They climb onto the wings before the propeller has even stopped spinning. They pour fresh fuel into the tanks, the harsh smell of octane washing over you. They push fresh belts of ammunition into the metal wings. You do not even climb out of the cockpit. You sit there, trapped in the narrow, metal seat. You push your heavy leather helmet back from your sweating forehead. A mechanic, a man with grease on his cheeks and a look of deep, quiet sympathy in his eyes, hands you a tin mug of lukewarm tea and a single, unlit cigarette. You take the tea with a trembling hand, the tin clinking softly against your teeth as you drink. And then, the telephone in the wooden hut rings again. To climb into the sky for the third or fourth time in a single day requires a sheer exertion of will that is almost impossible to imagine. The physical toll was absolute. Their flying gear, the thick canvas life jacket they called a Mae West, the heavy leather boots, the bulky parachute strapped to their backs, felt as though it weighed a ton. Picture a young pilot, scarcely 20 years old, trying to lift his leg onto the wing of his fighter for the fourth scramble of the afternoon. His muscles simply refuse to work. He stands there for a fraction of a second, staring at the metal wing, his breathing shallow and fast. He feels a sudden, overwhelming urge to just sit down on the grass and weep from the sheer exhaustion of it all. But then, he feels a pair of strong hands on his waist. It is his rigger, a quiet older man who has been watching him. Without a word, the rigger simply lifts the boy, boosting him up onto the wing. The boy looks down, offering a faint, grateful nod. The rigger pats his ankle. It is a profound, silent exchange of love and duty. I will carry you this far, the hands say. You must do the rest. Once in the air, a new enemy waited for them, an enemy that could not be outflown or outmaneuvered. It was the sun itself. Inside the small, glass canopy of the cockpit, the afternoon heat became a suffocating presence. It was like sitting inside a magnifying glass. The sun beat down on their shoulders, soaking their heavy wool tunics in sweat, stinging their eyes. The smell of hot engine oil, cordite, and their own fear filled the tiny space. But they could not look away from the light. In this new kind of warfare, the sun was a hiding place. The shadows they hunted, and the shadows that hunted them, would dive out of the blinding glare, hidden in the sheer brilliance of the light. And so, they had to stare into the sun. They squinted into the glaring, burning white until their eyes watered and their heads pounded with a fierce, throbbing ache. They strained to see small, dark specks dancing in the light, their necks swiveling constantly, rubbing raw against the collars of their shirts. Amidst the heat and the blinding light, there was the terrifying, seductive lullaby of the engine. The steady, vibrating drone of the great motor was hypnotic. Up in the thin, cold air of the higher altitudes, where the greenhouse heat of the sun met the freezing slipstream, the body became profoundly confused. The overwhelming urge to simply close their eyes, just for a second, to rest their heavy heads against the cold glass of the canopy, was almost unbearable. They fought sleep with the same desperate ferocity with which they fought the shadows and the clouds. They pinched their own legs, leaving deep, purple bruises on their thighs. They shouted into their empty oxygen masks, the sound of their own hoarse voices startling them awake. They opened the small side vents, letting the freezing, rushing air blast directly onto their faces to shock their heavy eyelids open. They were suspended between the earth and the heavens, fighting a lonely, terrible battle simply to stay awake. When they finally returned to the earth, dropping out of the sky like exhausted stones, the toll was painfully visible. Walking back to the dispersal hut, their legs would suddenly give way, their knees buckling under the weight of their own bodies. They would unbutton their tunics, their shirts plastered to their chests, their faces marked with the stark, pale circles of their oxygen masks, surrounded by soot, oil, and sweat. They looked like ghosts haunting their own lives. They would drag the canvas deck chairs out onto the grass, placing them in the meager shade of the wooden hut. You would see a boy simply collapse into the canvas, his head falling back, his mouth slightly open, instantly asleep before his heart had even fully slowed its racing beat. He does not dream. He simply vanishes into a heavy, dark void of exhaustion. Beside him, another boy is trying to stay awake just long enough to write a letter home. He rests a small, lined notepad on his knee. He holds the pen, but his hand is shaking so violently from the adrenaline and the fatigue that he cannot make the nib touch the paper. He stares at his own trembling hand with a detached, quiet wonder. It is as if the hand belongs to someone else. He takes a slow, deep breath. He grips his right wrist with his left hand, steadying himself with his own sheer willpower, and finally manages to press the pen to the page. He writes to his younger sister. He writes that the weather is wonderfully bright, though a bit too hot for his liking. He asks if the apples on the old tree in the back garden have ripened yet. He tells her that he is terribly tired, but he quickly adds that it is only because they are doing so much flying practice, and she mustn't worry mother about it. He signs his name with a jagged, uneven flourish, a beautiful, brave lie folded into a small blue envelope. Later, one of the WAFs, a young woman whose own eyes are dark with lack of sleep, walks softly out onto the grass. She carries a stack of thin, woolen blankets. The afternoon is sweltering, the heat rising from the dry earth in shimmering waves, but she knows the strange chills that follow the adrenaline. She approaches the sleeping boy in the deck chair. With a gentle, motherly care, she drapes the blanket over his chest, tucking it softly around his shoulders. He sighs in his sleep, his brow smoothing out for just a moment, comforted by the quiet, anonymous kindness. As the afternoon finally broke, bleeding into the bruised, beautiful purples and oranges of the evening, the airfields grew quiet. The sun, their heavy, blinding burden, finally sank below the hills, offering a profound, merciful relief. The shadows stretched long and cool across the cratered grass. The surviving machines stood silent in the twilight, their metal skins ticking as they cooled. The mechanics were quietly washing their hands in tin basins, the water turning black with oil and effort. In the mess halls, the true weight of the day was felt not in what was there, but in what was missing. The boys sat in the worn leather armchairs, holding glasses they barely drank from. They looked around the room, their eyes quietly passing over the empty chairs. The chairs where, just that morning, friends had sat complaining about the powdered eggs and laughing about a joke heard on the radio. Now, the chairs were just empty spaces in the room, silent testaments to the terrible cost of the daylight. There was no grand mourning, no loud weeping. They simply couldn't afford the energy it would take to break down. They processed their grief in a heavy, shared silence. A boy might reach over and quietly pick up a half-read book left on a side table by a friend who had not returned. He would carefully mark the page, close the cover, and set it softly aside. A quiet, heartbreaking gesture of respect for a story left unfinished. When they finally walked back to their narrow cots in the dark, the air was cool and sweet-smelling. They pulled the heavy boots from their aching feet, the sound dropping like stones on the wooden floor. They lay down on the damp sheets, pulling the blankets up to their chins. They knew that in a few short hours, the alarm clock would shatter the dark again. They knew the sun would rise, bringing the heat, the glare, and the heavy, terrifying responsibility of the sky back to their shoulders. But in that quiet, precious darkness, they allowed themselves to simply be boys again. They closed their burning, heavy eyes, they listened to the wind in the grass, and they surrendered to the deep, forgiving embrace of sleep, gathering whatever quiet strength they could find to face the weight of the sun one more time. There is a particular, heavy stillness that settles over a room when it is waiting for a footstep that will never come. When the long, bruising days of summer finally bled into dusk, a profound quiet would wash over the airfields. The great, roaring engines that had torn the sky apart since dawn were finally switched off, leaving behind a silence that felt almost thick enough to touch. The sweet, cooling air rushed in to replace the heat and the smoke, bringing with it the scent of crushed grass and cooling metal. Down on the flight line, the ground crews stood in the fading light, wiping their grease-stained hands on rough cotton rags. They watched the horizon until the very last drop of sunlight melted away. They counted the slender silhouettes that had touched down on the uneven turf, and they looked at the empty spaces on the grass where the others should have been. There was no shouting, no dramatic wailing in the twilight. There was only a slow, heavy sigh, a lowering of the eyes, and the quiet gathering of tools. To understand the true cost of that summer, you did not need to look at the sky. You only needed to look at the empty spaces left behind on the earth. In the officers' mess and the sergeants' quarters, the evening hours were a masterclass in quiet, heartbreaking dignity. The rooms were filled with the soft, yellow glow of shaded lamps and the scent of pipe tobacco, stale tea, and old leather. The surviving boys sat in the deep, worn armchairs. They were entirely drained, their faces pale beneath smudges of soot, their eyes carrying the distant, hollow stare of sheer exhaustion. They held their glasses, they turned the pages of newspapers they were barely reading, and they spoke in hushed, gentle murmurs. But the true weight of the room was held in the chairs that were unoccupied. There, by the unlit fireplace, was the chair where a boy from a quiet farming village had sat just that morning, laughing as he clumsily tried to mend a tear in his uniform. On a small wooden side table rested a coffee cup, half full and long since gone cold, left behind in the frantic rush of the final scramble. A paperback book lay face down on the cushion, its spine broken, its story forever paused at chapter 4. The survivors did not avoid these spaces, but they moved around them with a profound, unspoken reverence. They did not clear the cup right away. They did not move the book. They allowed the echoes of their friends to linger in the warm, lamplit room for just one more evening. They mourned not with grand speeches, but with a fierce, protective silence, guarding the memory of the missing simply by sitting together in the quiet dark. But eventually, the hardest task of all had to be done. Away from the soft murmur of the mess, down the narrow, dimly lit corridors of the wooden barracks, were the bedrooms. To open the door to one of these rooms was to step into a museum of a life suddenly suspended in amber. Imagine a friend, a young wingman who had flown off the right wing of the missing pilot all summer, stepping quietly into that room. He leaves the door slightly ajar, letting a sliver of hallway light fall across the floorboards. The room smells a familiar, comforting things, of clean wool, of a lavender soap, of the sharp tang of brass polish. On the narrow iron cot, the blankets are still thrown back, exactly as they were left in the cold, rushed hours before dawn. A pair of brown leather dancing shoes, slightly scuffed at the toes, peek out from beneath the bed. On the small wooden dresser, life has been paused mid-sentence. There is a hairbrush with a few stray strands of hair. A tin of mints, half empty. A neatly folded silk scarf. And there, standing proudly in a small silver frame, is a photograph. It is a picture of a smiling young woman standing in a sunny garden, or perhaps a proud mother and father standing on the front steps of a terraced house. The friend stands in the center of the room, listening to the gentle ticking of a wind-up clock on the bedside table. He takes a slow, deep breath, swallowing the heavy lump in his throat. He reaches for an empty leather trunk at the foot of the bed, unclasping the brass latches with a soft click. Packing the belongings of the fallen was a sacred, whispered ritual. It was an act of supreme tenderness performed by hands that, only hours before, had been gripping the firing buttons of a machine gun. He moves with slow, deliberate care. He takes the woolen cricket sweater from the back of the chair, smoothing his hands over the soft fabric, feeling the lingering warmth of the life it once held. He folds the sleeves inward, aligning the edges perfectly, and places it gently into the bottom of the trunk. He gathers the dancing shoes, the tin of mints, the silk scarf, handling each ordinary object as if it were made of the most fragile, precious glass. He is not just packing clothes, he is gathering up the pieces of a boy's heart, ensuring they are returned safely to the people who shaped it. And then, his eyes fall upon the small wooden desk in the corner. Resting on the blotting paper is a pale blue envelope. It is sealed, the flap pressed down tight, but there is no stamp in the corner. It is a letter written in the quiet hours of the night, left behind in the rush of the morning bell, waiting to be posted. He reaches out and picks up the envelope. It is featherlight in his hand, yet it feels as heavy as the world itself. He traces his thumb over the familiar, looping handwriting of his friend. What does it say inside? We can only imagine the beautiful, ordinary lies and the profound, unspoken truths hidden within that folded paper. Perhaps it says, "Dearest mother, the weather holds beautiful here, and I am eating well. Please do not worry for me, the danger is greatly exaggerated, and I spend most of my time simply waiting in the sun. I hope the roses have bloomed." Perhaps it says, "My darling, I keep your photograph tucked into my pocket when I fly. It gives me more courage than you could ever know. Save a dance for me when the autumn comes." These unsent letters were the final, quiet breaths of the boys who wrote them. They were filled with a desperate desire to protect their loved ones from the terror of the sky, to weave a blanket of normalcy and comfort to send back home. The friend looks at the envelope in the dim light. He does not open it. He simply places it gently on top of the folded woolen sweater in the trunk, exactly where it will be the very first thing a trembling hand will find when the trunk is finally opened at home. Miles away, in the sleeping villages and the darkened city streets, the ripples of these quiet losses were beginning to wash ashore. The telegram boys were the most feared visitors in the country that summer. They were often just teenagers themselves, pedaling their heavy red bicycles down country lanes and cobbled streets, their satchels heavy with devastating news. Imagine a mother standing at her kitchen sink in the early morning light. She is washing the breakfast cups, listening to the familiar, comforting sounds of the neighborhood waking up. She hears the squeak of bicycle brakes at the front gate. She hears the crunch of tires on the gravel path. Her hands stop moving in the warm, soapy water. The world outside the kitchen window suddenly goes terribly, breathlessly still. When she opens the front door, she sees the young boy holding out the small, yellow envelope. He refuses to meet her eyes, his own gaze fixed firmly on his scuffed boots, his shoulders heavy with the sorrow he has been asked to deliver. She takes the envelope with wet, trembling fingers. She does not scream. She steps back into the hallway, quietly closes the front door, and leans against the cool wallpaper. In that hushed, private moment, her universe shifts entirely off its axis. But she is not left alone in the dark for long. In the tightly knit streets of that time, grief was a shared burden. A neighbor, seeing the red bicycle depart, quietly unlatches the adjoining garden gate. She steps through the back door, carrying no words of grand philosophy, only a kettle and a profound, gentle presence. She takes the mother by the arm, guiding her softly to the kitchen chair. She strikes a match, lighting the stove, and waits for the water to boil. They sit at the wooden table, the yellow paper resting between them. The neighbor reaches out, placing her warm, work-roughened hand over the mother's trembling one. There is no need to fill the air with empty comforts. The simple, physical warmth of another human being, the quiet pouring of the tea, the shared, silent tears falling into a cotton handkerchief, this was the everyday heroism of the home front. It was the fierce, gentle promise that no one would be left to carry the weight of the sky alone. Back on the airfields, as the night deepened and the chill settled over the grass, the trunk was finally closed. The brass latches were snapped shut, sealing the echoes of the missing boy inside. The friend turns off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, and quietly pulls the door shut behind him. He walks back out into the cool night air. He looks up at the vast, sprawling canopy of the stars. The sky is no longer a blinding, terrifying expanse of blue. It is a soft, forgiving blanket of deep velvet, dotted with a million pinpricks of gentle light. The wind rustles through the tall grass at the edge of the field, a soft, hushed sound that feels like a whispered lullaby. The boys who did not return to the mess hall, the boys who left their beds unmade and their letters unsent, are not truly gone. They have simply slipped away from the heavy, pulling weight of the earth. They have become part of the quiet twilight, part of the rustling wind, part of the peaceful, starry night they fought so fiercely to protect. The friend stands in the dark, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, and breathes in the sweet night air. He carries the memory of his wingman in his heart, a quiet, glowing ember that will keep him warm when the dawn breaks again. And then, he turns and walks slowly back toward his own narrow cot, surrendering to the gentle, necessary embrace of sleep, while the stars stand there silent, eternal watch over the sleeping green earth. There was an evening when the sun finally dipped below the horizon, but the sky above the great city simply refused to grow dark. For so many long, breathless weeks, the sprawling heart of London had lived on the edge of the storm. The millions of souls who walked its winding, cobbled streets and busy avenues had grown accustomed to a strange, distant kind of war. They had listened to the faint, muffled thunder rolling in from the green fields of Kent and the white cliffs of Sussex. They had watched the high, wispy contrails tangle in the blue summer sky, reading the newspaper accounts of the boys in the clouds. But the danger had always felt like a tempest raging in another room. The great city had held its breath, hoping the shadow would pass them by. And then, the wind shifted. The vast, dark armada in the sky turned its gaze away from the quiet country airfields and followed the silver, winding ribbon of the River Thames. The storm had finally come to the city. It fell first, and hardest, upon the East End. This was not a place of grand, sweeping boulevards or quiet, manicured parks. The East End was a dense, beating heart of narrow streets, tightly packed terraced houses, and towering brick warehouses. It was a world entirely its own, built on the edge of the great docks. On any normal evening, the air here smelled of river mud, roasted coffee, exotic spices unloaded from merchant ships, and the comforting, yeasty scent of the local breweries. It was a place where neighbors lived close enough to hear one another's kettles whistle, where washing lines were strung like fragile bridges across the alleyways, and where front doors were famously left unlocked. The people of the East End were woven together by a profound, unyielding sense of community. When the deep, mechanical thrum of the bombers finally eclipsed the sounds of the city, the sirens did not just warn of a passing skirmish. They heralded the arrival of a new, terrifying reality. As the sun set that fateful evening, the blackout curtains were drawn tight, just as they had been for months. But the darkness they had relied upon to hide them was suddenly, brutally stolen away. If you stood on a high rooftop or a quiet hill overlooking the city that night, the sight that met your eyes was one of tragic, overwhelming beauty. The horizon began to glow. It started as a soft, bruised purple, melting into a deep, fiery orange that pushed back the night. The great timber yards, the storehouses filled with rum and sugar, the old, dry wood of 1,000 homes, they caught the spark, and the city began to burn. The light of the fires bathed the streets in a warm, flickering amber. It cast long, strange shadows against the brickwork. It was a terrifying illumination, turning the familiar, comforting maze of the city into a surreal landscape of light and smoke. Up in the air, the smoke gathered into thick, heavy clouds, turning the moon the color of a dull copper coin. And then, the ash began to fall. It drifted down through the warm air like a gentle, gray snow. It settled softly onto the slate roofs, onto the shoulders of abandoned overcoats, onto the quiet, dark waters of the Thames, which reflected the burning sky like a ribbon of liquid fire. Down in the streets, beneath this canopy of embers, the people of the East End were finding new ways to survive. They did not flee in a panic. They gathered their sleeping children, wrapping them in thick woolen blankets, and made their way to the shelters. They descended into the damp cellars, the reinforced railway arches, and the deep, tiled tunnels of the underground. In one such shelter, beneath the shuddering earth, the air was thick with the smell of plaster dust and the faint, sweet scent of peppermint from a shared tin of sweets. A young woman sat on a wooden bench, leaning her head against the curved brick wall. Her hands, rough from working at the local grocer's, were folded tightly in her lap. Next to her, a stranger, an elderly man still wearing his flat cap and clutching a wooden walking stick, gently draped his own heavy coat over her shivering shoulders. They did not speak. The terrible, rhythmic thudding from the world above made conversation impossible. But in the dim, flickering light of a single hurricane lamp, the young woman pulled a small notepad from her pocket. She held a pencil stub in her trembling fingers, struggling to keep her hand steady as the ground vibrated beneath her shoes. She was writing to her sister in the countryside. She wrote not of the terrifying noise, nor the heat of the fires they had run from. Instead, she wrote about the quiet kindness of the old man beside her. She wrote about the strange, beautiful way the sparks had danced in the air before they went underground. She wrote, in simple, brave words, that their street might look different tomorrow, but they were all together, and they were all safe. She folded the note, a tiny, defiant spark of love hidden deep in the dark, waiting for the dawn. While thousands sheltered below, a different kind of quiet heroism was unfolding above them, right on the edge of the flames. Scattered across the rooftops of the glowing city were the fire watchers. They were not soldiers. They were bakers, bank clerks, school teachers, and grandfathers. They wore heavy tin helmets and carried simple buckets of water, mounds of sand, and long-handled shovels. Imagine an older man, a tailor by trade, standing alone on the flat lead roof of his apartment building. The air around him is stiflingly hot, filled with the roar of burning timber and the continuous, tearing sound of the sky. He feels incredibly small beneath the vastness of the glowing heavens. But when a small, hissing incendiary bomb clatters onto the roof nearby, spinning and throwing off blinding white sparks, he does not run. He steps forward into the heat. With slow, deliberate courage, he pours his bucket of sand over the sparking metal, smothering the harsh light until only a quiet, smoking lump remains. He wipes the sweat and soot from his eyes with the back of his sleeve, leans on his shovel, and looks out over the burning skyline. He is watching the city he loves, the city where he learned to walk, where he fell in love, where he raised his children, change its shape in the night. It is a profound, aching sorrow. But as he stands there, silhouetted against the orange glow, he is the very embodiment of the city's unbreakable heart. When the long, terrible night finally began to loosen its grip, and the sirens sounded the single, flat note of the all-clear, the city awoke to a profoundly altered world. The people slowly emerged from the cellars and the tunnels, their eyes blinking against the stinging, smoke-filled air. The morning light was muted, struggling to pierce the thick, fragrant haze of burning wood and spices that hung over the streets. They walked back to their neighborhoods, stepping carefully over tangled fire hoses and shattered glass that glittered on the pavements like fallen diamonds. Some found their homes exactly as they had left them, untouched and waiting. Others turned the corner of their familiar street only to find a smoking, jagged ruin where their front door used to be. The shock was immense, a heavy, silent weight that settled over the cobblestones. You could see it in the way a mother stared at the broken porcelain of her favorite teacup, resting perfectly intact atop a pile of pulverized brick. You could see it in the way a man quietly picked up a scorched piece of wood from the rubble of his workshop, turning it over and over in his hands. But the despair did not take root. It was immediately, fiercely chased away by the sheer, stubborn resilience of the East End. Almost before the dust had settled, the quiet, defiant rituals of everyday life began to reassert themselves. A woman, her face smudged with soot, dragged a heavy iron kettle out of the wreckage of her kitchen. She built a small fire on the pavement using the splintered wood of her own roof, boiled the water, and began handing out chipped mugs of hot, sweet tea to the exhausted firemen and her neighbors. Down the street, the owner of a small bakery, the front of his shop entirely blown away, swept the glass from his counter. He found a piece of torn cardboard and a piece of charcoal, and wrote 3 words in bold, uneven letters, "Business as usual." He hung it from a surviving piece of the doorframe and began to arrange his few surviving loaves of bread. This was the true miracle of the city of embers. The sky had rained fire, the buildings had crumbled, and the horizon had burned with a tragic, terrible light. But the people had not broken. As the sun climbed higher, trying to burn through the pall of smoke, the great dome of St. Paul's Cathedral emerged from the haze, standing tall and entirely untouched, a majestic, silent guardian watching over the battered streets. The River Thames continued its slow, steady journey to the sea, carrying the fallen ash away with the tide. The people of the city drank their tea on the swept pavements. They held one another's hands, they shared their meager rations, and they looked at the changed shape of their home with a quiet, unyielding pride. They knew the bombers would return when the sun went down. They knew the sky would glow orange once more. But they also knew, with a profound and quiet certainty, that a city is not made of bricks and timber. It is made of the people who walk its streets. And the people of this city, forged in the heat of that endless summer, were proving themselves to be completely, beautifully indestructible. As evening approached again, they simply washed their faces, drew the blackout curtains over the broken windows, and waited, together, in the resilient, glowing heart of the embers. The greatest act of defiance in a broken world was the simple, stubborn whistle of a boiling kettle. When the long, terrifying roar of the night finally exhausted itself, and the single, flat note of the all-clear sounded across the bruised horizon, the great city woke to a strange and fragile dawn. The morning light was pale and timid, struggling to pierce the thick, fragrant haze of plaster dust and wood smoke that hung in the quiet air. The streets, once familiar and neatly arranged, had been transformed into a surreal, jagged landscape. Mountains of pulverized brick spilled across the roads. Tangled wires draped over shattered trees like weeping willow branches. The air tasted of ash, and the silence was so profound it almost rang in the ears. It would have been so easy, in that devastating quiet, to simply sit down in the rubble and weep. It would have been entirely forgivable to look at the fractured shape of the neighborhood and surrender to the despair that the falling sky had intended to bring. But as the pale sun began to warm the slate roofs, a different sound began to rise beneath the smoke. It was a slow, rhythmic, scratching sound. It was the sound of stiff bristle brooms brushing against the stone pavements. If you walked down one of those shattered streets in the early morning, stepping carefully over the debris, you would see them. Women and men, their faces still pale with exhaustion, their clothes dusted with a fine layer of gray ash, standing outside the ruins of their homes. A woman wearing a floral apron over her dress, her hair tied back in a patterned scarf, was methodically sweeping the pavement in front of her house. Her windows were entirely blown out. The front door hung off its hinges. The roof was open to the pale blue sky. But she was sweeping the front step. It was not a practical act. The dust was everywhere, and the wind would only blow it back again. But it was a profound, necessary act of the soul. It was a way for her hands to claim order out of unimaginable chaos. It was a physical declaration that this was still her home, this was still her street, and she would not allow the violence of the night to dictate the dignity of her mourning. And she was not alone in this quiet rebellion. From down the road came the slow, heavy clopping of hooves. Through the lingering smoke, a horse-drawn cart appeared. It was the local milkman. His white coat was smudged with soot, and his horse tossed its head nervously at the unfamiliar smell of the broken city, but they moved forward, steady and deliberate. The cart rattled over loose cobblestones and splintered wood. The milkman stopped his horse before a towering pile of rubble that used to be a corner shop. He picked up his wire carrier, the glass bottles clinking together with a gentle, musical, incredibly ordinary sound. He stepped carefully over a fallen lamppost, navigated the edge of a deep crater in the road, and walked up to a solitary brick archway, the only part of the house still standing. He set 2 pints of milk down on the step, exactly where he had left them the morning before, and the morning before that. He touched the brim of his cap to the woman sweeping the pavement. She offered a tired, genuine smile in return. It was a surreal pantomime of peacetime. To an outsider, it might have looked like madness to deliver milk to a house without walls. But to the people of the street, it was the very anchor of their sanity. If the milkman was still doing his rounds, if the bottles still chimed in their wire carrier, then the world had not truly ended. The sun had risen, and the day required its milk. Soon, the postman arrived, his heavy canvas satchel slung across his shoulder. He walked down the street, consulting his letters and looking at the jagged silhouettes of the terraces. Sometimes, a house was simply gone, replaced by a smoking absence. He would stand before the gap, adjust his dark blue cap, and look for a familiar crevice in the surviving masonry. He would carefully slide a pale blue envelope beneath a loose brick or tuck it safely into the hollow of a shattered window frame, trusting that the people who belonged to that space would return to find it. What words were carried in that canvas bag? In the darkness of the shelters the night before, countless letters had been written by the faint light of shielded torches. Imagine a grandfather sitting on a damp mattress in the underground, his knees drawn up, writing on the back of a torn envelope. He writes to his son, who was serving on a ship far out in the cold, gray sea. He doesn't write about the terrifying vibration of the earth or the smell of burning timber. He writes, "The garden wall took a bit of a tumble last night, but your mother's rosebush miraculously survived the dust. The neighbors are well. We are keeping the home fires burning, quite literally in some places. Do not worry for us. Keep your feet warm. He sends love. He sends comfort. He weaves a protective blanket of normalcy to shield his boy from the terror of the city." These letters were acts of fierce, protective love, insisting that the bonds of family were far stronger than the bombs falling from the dark. But of all the quiet rebellions that took place in the fractured morning, none was more sacred, or more beautifully ordinary, than the making of the tea. The gas lines beneath the streets were often broken, the water mains severed, and the stoves buried beneath tons of brick and plaster. But the people of the city would not be denied their morning comfort. On a street corner, where the ash still drifted like dirty snow, a small group of neighbors gathered. A man in a dusty waistcoat brought out a battered, blackened iron kettle, miraculously salvaged from his ruined kitchen. A young woman carried a pitcher of fresh water she had drawn from an emergency standpipe 3 streets away. They did not have a hearth, so they built one on the curb. They gathered the splinters of their broken world, a piece of a shattered wardrobe, a length of a ruined window frame, a scorched floorboard, and built a small, modest fire on the cobblestones. They struck a match, the sulfur smelling sharp against the smoke, and watched the flames catch the dry wood. They placed the heavy kettle on the makeshift fire. And then, they waited. They stood in a loose circle around the warmth, their hands deep in their pockets, shivering slightly in the morning chill. They were bankers, factory workers, tailors, and grandmothers, their social divisions entirely erased by the shared covering of gray dust. They did not speak much. They simply watched the small, dancing flames, listening to the water begin to hiss and bubble against the hot iron. When the kettle finally began to whistle, a low, breathy sound cutting through the quiet of the street, it was the most victorious music they could imagine. It was the counter-melody to the terrible, wailing sirens of the night. From pockets and woven shopping bags, the chipped porcelain mugs and mismatched saucers appeared. The hot water was poured over the precious, rationed tea leaves, turning a deep, comforting amber. A small, tin box was passed around with profound reverence. It held sugar. In a time when sweetness was rare, to share a spoonful of sugar with a neighbor whose name you hardly knew was an act of profound, startling generosity. The tea was handed out. The warmth of the porcelain seeped into their cold, tired fingers. They lifted the mugs to their lips, blowing softly across the rising steam. As the hot, sweet liquid washed away the taste of the chalk and the ash, a visible change came over the group. Shoulders that had been hunched tightly against the terror of the night began to gently drop. Color slowly returned to pale, soot-stained cheeks. A deep, collective sigh seemed to ripple through the air. A woman looked over the rim of her cup at the smoking ruin of her own roof, then turned to the neighbor beside her. "Well," she said softly, her voice raspy from the smoke, "at least I won't have to clean those upstairs windows anymore." A soft, tired ripple of laughter passed around the circle. It was a gentle, understated joke, but it held the power of 1,000 armies. This was the quiet, unbreakable heart of the city. The enemy above believed that if they destroyed the buildings, they would destroy the mind. They believed that terror would turn neighbors against one another, that the darkness would shatter their resolve. They did not understand the power of the mundane. They did not understand that to boil a kettle on the broken ruins of your own life is the ultimate declaration of victory. It is a way of looking up at the sky and whispering, "You may break our stones, you may burn our timber, but you cannot stop us from living. We will still sweep our steps. We will still deliver our milk. We will still drink our tea." As the morning stretched on, the golden sunlight finally burned through the last of the haze, casting long, warm shadows across the rubble. The fire on the curb slowly died down to glowing, red embers. The mugs were emptied, leaving only damp tea leaves clinging to the porcelain. The neighbors quietly rinsed their cups with the last drops of the water from the pitcher. They brushed the ash from their sleeves. They offered one another small, reassuring nods, the silent promise of a community that had been tested by fire and found to be entirely solid. They turned back to the wreckage. There was wood to be cleared, glass to be swept, loved ones to be searched for, and a long, exhausting day of survival ahead. They knew, with a heavy, quiet certainty, that when the sun went down again, the sirens would wail, and the sky would catch fire once more. But for now, the morning was theirs. They had claimed it with a broom, a milk bottle, and a chipped mug of hot tea. They walked back into the ruins of their homes, their steps a little steadier, their hearts warmed by the quiet, everyday heroism of simply carrying on, ready to face whatever the fading light would bring. There is a moment when a great wave reaches its absolute peak, hanging suspended in the air for just a fraction of a heartbeat before it finally decides to break and roll back to the sea. By the time the middle of September arrived, the entire country felt like it was caught in that suspended heartbeat. The golden warmth of the long summer was just beginning to fray at the edges, giving way to the crisp, fragile chill of early autumn. The leaves on the great oak trees were turning tired and brown, ready to fall, and the people of the island felt very much the same. They had been stretched so thin, for so long, that it seemed as though the very fabric of their lives was made of gossamer, ready to tear in the next strong wind. The exhaustion was no longer just a physical sensation, it was a quiet, heavy companion that sat in the corner of every room. You could see it in the hollowed eyes of the milkman as he navigated the broken streets, in the slow, deliberate way a mother buttoned her child's coat, and in the trembling hands of the young girls pouring tea in the underground shelters. The nation was running on nothing but the fumes of its own quiet courage. On the airfields, the boys of the summer sky had aged a lifetime in the span of a few months. They moved like sleepwalkers through the damp morning grass. When the scramble bells shattered the dawn, they did not run with the nervous, bounding energy of July. They pulled themselves up from their canvas cots with a heavy, aching reluctance, forcing their bruised bodies into cold leather flying jackets. There was a terrifying, unspoken rumor whispering through the plotting rooms and the wooden barracks. It was the terrifying knowledge that the reserves were empty. There were no more fresh faces to pull from the quiet training schools, no more pristine, shining machines hidden away in reserve hangars. Every boy who could fly was already in the air. Every mechanic who could hold a spanner was already standing in the dust. The great, invisible wall protecting the island was cracked and crumbling, held together only by the sheer, desperate willpower of the exhausted souls standing upon it. And then came a Sunday morning that felt unlike any other. It began with a beautiful, deceptive peace. The sky was an unbroken canopy of soft, washed-out blue, swept clean by the autumn winds. In the towns and villages, church bells that had been silenced for months remained quiet, but people still walked the familiar paths to their chapels, seeking whatever comfort could be found in the old stone walls and the familiar, gentle hymns. But as the morning wore on, the air began to change. It was a feeling before it was a sound. A heavy, suffocating pressure building in the atmosphere, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. And then, the vibration started. It was deeper, wider, and more profound than anything they had felt before. It hummed in the floorboards of the terraced houses, it rattled the teacups sitting on the kitchen tables, and it sent the birds scattering from the trees in silent, panicked flocks. The storm was returning. But this time, it felt entirely different. It felt absolute. Across the southern shires and the fractured streets of the great city, people did not run for the deep shelters right away. Instead, they stepped out of their back doors. They walked into their small, walled gardens, they stood on the cobblestone pavements, and they shaded their eyes against the glare of the morning sun. Imagine a father standing in his small patch of garden, his hand resting gently on the shoulder of his young son. He is wearing his Sunday waistcoat, dusted lightly with plaster from the night before. He looks up. He does not say a word, because words are entirely useless against the sheer, terrifying scale of what is arriving. The dark tide was spilling over the coastline, an armada so vast it seemed to blot out the light. The distant hum grew into a deafening, mechanical roar that vibrated in the chest and made the teeth ache. But as the people watched from their gardens, a strange, beautiful thing happened. From the hidden airfields, from the patched and cratered meadows, the defenders rose to meet the tide. They climbed in pairs and small groups, their engines screaming as they fought for altitude. To the watchers on the ground, the battle was not a mechanical conflict of metal and oil. It was a silent, abstract ballet painted across the vast canvas of the heavens. They watched as pure white contrails began to weave across the blue, like chalk lines drawn by an invisible, frantic hand. The lines looped and spiraled, tangling together into a chaotic, mesmerizing web that stretched from horizon to horizon. Sometimes, there would be a sudden, brief flash of silver as the sun caught the wing of a diving machine. Sometimes, the soft, muffled thud of distant gunfire would drift down like the sound of a dry branch snapping in a winter forest. And sometimes, heartbreakingly, a thin trail of black smoke would draw a straight, dark line down toward the earth, like a tear falling from the eye of the sky. The father in the garden holds his son's hand a little tighter. He feels a profound, suffocating anxiety. He knows, just as the mother sweeping her step knows, just as the old baker standing in his ruined shop knows, that everything they love, everything they are, rests on the shoulders of the boys dancing in the white trails above. Down in the plotting rooms, buried deep beneath the earth, the tension was a physical weight. The young women of the auxiliary stood around the great map, their faces pale in the dim light. They moved the wooden blocks with long, steady sticks, watching the overwhelming clusters of the enemy pressing inward, closer and closer to the heart of the country. An officer, his uniform crisp but his eyes dark with a sleepless dread, asks a quiet question into the hushed room. He asks what other squadrons can be sent up to plug the gaps. He asks where the reserves are. A young woman, her headset pressed tightly to her ears, her voice remarkably calm, simply shakes her head. There is no one left. Every single machine, every single tired boy, is already in the sky. There is nothing left to throw into the storm. They have reached the absolute edge of the world, and they must either hold the line, or fall into the dark. The room goes terribly still. They listen to the crackling voices on the radio, they watch the map, and they hold their breath. It is a moment of pure, terrifying vulnerability. The fate of the nation is balancing on the edge of a knife, resting entirely on the exhausted hearts of the few. Up in the freezing, thin air, the young pilots were fighting a battle of sheer, desperate instinct. They were flying on the very fumes of their own consciousness. Their arms ached with the effort of throwing their heavy machines through the sky. Their eyes burned from the blinding sun and the sharp, freezing wind leaking into their cockpits. They did not feel like heroes. They felt only the frantic, pulling need to protect the patchwork quilt of green and brown fields far below them, the quiet houses where their mothers and sisters were waiting. They threw themselves into the dark tide again and again, their ammunition ticking away, their fuel gauges dropping dangerously close to empty. They fought with a wild, beautiful desperation. And then, slowly, remarkably, the invisible breaking point was reached. It was not marked by a sudden, victorious shout. It was a quiet, subtle shift in the great, roaring momentum of the day. The vast, dark armada, which had seemed so unstoppable, so infinite, began to hesitate. The endless waves of bombers, battered and harassed by the relentless, stinging attacks of the boys in the clouds, found that they could push no further. The wave had reached its absolute crest. It hung there, suspended in the bright September sky, and then the tide began to turn. To the people watching from their gardens, the change was gentle. The furious, tangled web of white contrails began to drift apart, blown into soft, harmless clouds by the high-altitude winds. The deafening, throbbing roar of the engines began to lessen, softening from a terrifying thunder into a distant, receding hum. The dark silhouettes turned their noses back toward the sea, retreating into the hazy distance over the channel. The sky, which had been torn apart for hours, slowly began to heal. The deep blue returned, calm and indifferent. On the airfields, the ground crews stood by the edges of the grass, shading their eyes, waiting for their boys to come home. They listened to the coughing, sputtering engines as the surviving fighters drifted down from the heavens. They landed heavily on the uneven turf, bouncing and sliding, their metal skins torn, their canvas wings shredded. When the engines finally died, the silence that fell over the meadows was profound. It was a heavy, exhausted silence, but it was entirely different from the anxious, breathless quiet of the early summer. This was the silence of survival. A young mechanic walks up to a ruined Hurricane. The pilot slides the canopy back, but he does not stand up. He simply leans his head against the cold metal rim of the cockpit, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and shallow. The mechanic does not rush him. He steps onto the wing, reaches out, and gently places his hand over the pilot's trembling fingers. "You made it back," the mechanic whispers, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. The pilot nods, just barely. He unclips his oxygen mask, leaving a pale, sweat-stained circle around his mouth. He looks out over the scarred, chalky earth of the airfield, and then up at the clearing sky. He knows, in the quiet, aching depths of his own bones, that something fundamental has shifted. The storm had thrown its absolute worst at them. It had pushed them to the very brink of the abyss. But they had not broken. As the late afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a soft, golden light over the broken cities and the quiet villages. A deep, collective exhale seemed to ripple across the entire nation. In the underground shelters, grandmothers folded their knitting and quietly told their grandchildren that perhaps they might sleep in their own beds tonight. In the East End, the man who had boiled the kettle on the curb earlier that morning took off his flat cap, wiped his brow, and looked at his surviving neighbors with a quiet, knowing smile. The battle was not entirely over. There would still be dark nights ahead, and the sirens would still sing their mournful songs. But the terrifying spell of inevitability had been broken. The shadow that had threatened to swallow them whole had been met, it had been fought to a standstill, and it had been turned back. That evening, as twilight wrapped the island in its bruised, beautiful colors, the blackout curtains were drawn once more. The tea was poured. The unsent letters were carefully folded away in the dark barracks. If you stepped outside into the cool night air, the wind smelled faintly of fallen leaves and wood smoke. The stars began to appear, tiny pinpricks of light in a vast, peaceful canopy. It was a gentle, soothing night. The earth was battered, the people were tired beyond all human measure, but they were safe. They lay down in their beds, they pulled the woolen blankets tightly around their shoulders, and they listened to the quiet rustle of the autumn breeze outside their windows. They closed their eyes, wrapped in the profound, comforting knowledge that the line, though stretched to an impossible, gossamer thinness, had held. The tide had turned, and the long, terrible summer was finally giving way to a hopeful, quiet autumn. There was a morning when the wind blowing off the channel no longer carried the heavy heat of summer, but the crisp, quiet promise of falling leaves. For so many months, the sun had been a brilliant, unyielding eye, glaring down upon the green fields and the broken streets. It had baked the earth dry, turning the grass of the airfields into a pale, dusty yellow, and it had illuminated every corner of the sky for the hunters and the hunted. The summer had felt endless, a suspended eternity of blue skies and deafening noise. But the earth has its own ancient rhythms, rhythms that ignore the quarrels of men and the mechanical thunder of war. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the axis of the world began to tilt away from the light. You could feel it before you could truly see it. It was a subtle, physical shift in the air. When the back doors of the terraced houses were opened in the early hours, the air that drifted into the kitchens was no longer warm and heavy. It carried a sudden, surprising bite. It was the sharp, clean scent of frost and damp soil. Out on the fighter stations, the young men who had slept for months with their windows thrown wide open to catch a breeze began to pull thin, woolen blankets tightly under their chins. When the orderlies woke them in the dark, the boys did not wake to stifling heat, but to a profound, shivering cold. They swung their legs out of their narrow cots and felt the icy shock of the wooden floorboards beneath their bare feet. They reached into their trunks, brushing past the silk scarves of August, and pulled out thick, heavy sweaters knitted from rough, gray wool. As they walked out to the dispersal huts, their boots crunched softly against grass that was delicately laced with white frost. Their breath plumed in the air before them in small, pale clouds. This cold, this biting nip in the autumn air, was not a hardship. It was an absolute, overwhelming mercy. With the cold came the changing of the light. The sun, which had hung so high and blinding for so long, began to take a lower, softer path across the horizon. The glaring white light softened into a slanted, golden hue. It cast long, forgiving shadows across the craters and the torn canvas of the airfields. But the most profound, beautiful change of all was the shortening of the days. In the height of the summer, the daylight had stretched on relentlessly, meaning the danger stretched on with it. The boys had flown from the earliest hours of the morning until the stars were firmly fixed in the night sky. But now, as autumn swept in, the dusk began to arrive earlier and earlier. By late afternoon, the sky would bruise into deep purples and burnt oranges. The shadows would quickly swallow the fields. And with the darkness came safety. Imagine a young pilot standing outside his wooden hut at 5:30 in the evening. Just a few weeks ago, at this hour, he would have been squinting into the blinding glare, waiting for the heavy ring of the telephone, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. But now, the sun is already sinking below the tree line. The mechanics are quietly throwing heavy canvas tarps over the engine cowlings of the Spitfires to protect them from the evening dew. The pilot leans against the wooden doorframe, slipping his cold hands deep into the pockets of his fleece-lined jacket. He watches the twilight gather. The telephone inside the hut is silent. The sky is simply too dark, too unpredictable for the great armadas to cross the water. A slow, tentative smile touches the corners of his mouth. He has survived another day, and the day is finally over. The night belongs to him. This creeping darkness brought a cautious, fragile sense of relief to weary souls across the entire country. In the cities, where the rubble of the summer still spilled across the pavements, the wardrobe of survival began to change. Women wrapped thick woolen scarves around their heads, and men pulled the collars of their overcoats up around their ears. As they swept their front steps or walked to the grocer with their ration books, they felt the wind pulling the brown and golden leaves from the great oak trees, sending them skittering down the cobblestones. The air in the city smelled differently now. The sharp, acrid stench of cordite and burning timber was slowly being replaced by the familiar, comforting scent of coal fires and wood smoke. It was the smell of Sunday afternoons in peacetime, of toasted bread and warm hearths. It was a smell that whispered to them that the world had not entirely ended, that the seasons were still turning, and that winter was coming to cool the fever of the world. And the skies, slowly but surely, were growing just a little bit quieter. The massive, terrifying swarms of bombers that had once blotted out the sun began to thin. The weather, which had been the enemy's greatest ally in the clear days of summer, was now turning into a fierce, gray shield for the island. Deep banks of heavy clouds rolled in from the Atlantic, carrying rain and thick, obscuring fog. To the men and women on the ground, these gray, miserable days were beautiful. When they woke to find the sky covered in a blanket of low, weeping clouds, they did not complain about the gloom. They poured their morning tea with steady hands and offered quiet, whispered thanks to the heavens. They knew the rain meant the bombers were grounded. The bad weather was a heavy, wet blanket thrown over the fires of the conflict. In the damp, quiet hours of these gray afternoons, letters were written with a new, gentle tone. Picture a young woman in the auxiliary, sitting at her desk in a wooden hut on the edge of an airfield. The rain is drumming a steady, soothing rhythm against the tin roof. The small iron stove in the corner crackles, casting a warm, orange glow over her face. She has a mug of hot cocoa resting beside her writing pad. She is writing to her mother. For months, her letters had been brief, forced notes of false cheer, trying to hide the sheer exhaustion and terror of her days. But today, the tension in her shoulders has finally begun to loosen. She writes, "The rain has been falling since dawn, and it is the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. The boys have been grounded all day. They are sitting in the mess hall playing cards, and I can actually hear them laughing. Truly laughing, not just making noise to fill the silence. I wore the blue scarf you knitted for me today, and it kept out the wind perfectly. I think, perhaps, the worst of it is behind us." She pauses, listening to the gentle drumming of the rain. She closes her eyes and takes a deep breath of the warm, smoky air. It is a moment of profound, ordinary peace. She signs the letter, seals it, and rests her head against her hand, allowing the rhythmic sound of the autumn rain to wash away the lingering echoes of the summer. Down on the jagged coastline, the watchers on the cliffs also felt the turning of the tide. The older men of the Observer Corps stood in their sandbagged pits, pulling their heavy waterproof capes tightly around their shoulders to ward off the biting sea spray. The English Channel, which had been a glittering, flat mirror of blue all summer, was now a churning, restless expanse of dark gray water, capped with white foam. The wind howled around them, a lonely, ancient sound. They lifted their heavy binoculars, peering into the mist and the low clouds. But more often than not, the sky was empty. The persistent, vibrating hum of distant engines that had haunted their watches for so long was beginning to fade. Sometimes, entire hours would pass with nothing but the sound of the wind and the crashing of the waves against the chalk. It was not a sudden silence. The war had not vanished. There were still sudden, sharp skirmishes in the clouds. There were still nights when the sirens wailed their mournful songs, and the people had to gather their blankets and descend into the damp earth. But the relentless, suffocating pressure had broken. The great beast that had clawed at the sky all summer was losing its breath. The attacks became sporadic, hesitant, as if the enemy themselves had been worn down by the sheer, unyielding granite of the island's defense. This gradual lessening of the danger brought a strange, almost disorienting feeling to the people. When a body has been braced for impact for so long, the absence of the blow feels almost confusing. If a siren did not sound by mid-morning, people would stop in the streets, looking up at the cloudy sky with a mixture of hope and disbelief. They would cautiously return to their gardens, pulling up the last of the summer carrots and planting winter cabbages in the cold soil. They moved gently, quietly, afraid that if they made too much noise, or celebrated too loudly, they might wake the sleeping storm. It was a time of healing, wrapped in wool and wood smoke. On the airfields, the ground crews finally had time to truly repair the wounded machines. Instead of frantic, desperate patches made in the dust between scrambles, they could work deliberately. They replaced torn fabric, tightened loose rivets, and painted over the scars of the summer. The aircraft standing on the damp grass looked whole again. And the boys who flew them began to look whole again, too. The dark, hollow circles beneath their eyes slowly began to fade. The nervous, trembling energy in their hands settled into a calm stillness. They began to talk about the future again, not just the next hour or the next day, but the coming winter. They talked about going home for Christmas, about sitting by their own fireplaces, about the quiet lives they had left behind and the lives they hoped to return to. As the autumn deepened, pulling the last leaves from the trees and laying them like a golden carpet across the battered earth, the fading of the roar became undeniable. The sky, once a terrifying arena of fire and falling shadows, was slowly being reclaimed by the birds, the clouds, and the quiet winds. The grand, sprawling epic of the summer was drawing to a close, not with a triumphant, cinematic cheer, but with a collective, exhausted sigh. When the dusk settled over the country now, bringing the dark early and wrapping the villages in a freezing, protective blanket, the people did not look to the horizon with dread. They drew their blackout curtains, they stoked their small fires, and they sat together in the warm, amber light of their homes. They listened to the autumn wind rattling the window panes, a sound that no longer sounded like the prelude to a nightmare, but simply like the turning of the earth. They were alive. The air was cold, the tea was warm, and the sky was finally returning to silence. And as they drifted into sleep, the fading roar of the engines was replaced by the gentle, steady heartbeat of a nation that had weathered the absolute worst, and was quietly, bravely learning how to breathe again. There is a silence so profound that it feels not like the absence of noise, but like a soft, heavy blanket draped carefully over the shoulders of a weary world. When the last of the autumn gales finally blew themselves out, sweeping the lingering smoke and the heavy, bruised clouds out across the sea, they left behind a sky that was miraculously, beautifully clear. The great storm of the summer, which had raged with such deafening fury, had finally broken against the quiet, unyielding cliffs of the island. And in its wake came the deep, freezing peace of an early winter night. For months, the darkness had been a complicated friend. It had hidden the cities from the terror of the day, yet it had also harbored the heavy, droning shadows of the night. But on this particular evening, the true night returned. It was not a canvas for searchlights or a backdrop for falling embers. It was simply the night. Vast, indifferent, and exquisitely peaceful. If you had walked out of your front door into the freezing air, the first thing you would have noticed was the sheer, breathtaking stillness. The air was no longer thick with the dust of broken bricks or the sharp, acrid scent of cordite. It tasted of frost, of cold earth, and of the sea. Down on the southern coast, where the great white chalk cliffs stand like ancient, silent sentinels facing the dark water, the watchers were still at their posts. The men of the observer corps stood in their sandbagged pits, wrapped in layers of thick wool and heavy waterproof canvas. The cold was bitter, biting at their cheeks and numbing their fingers, but they did not mind. Because for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they could hear the ocean. Without the endless, mechanical thrumming of engines vibrating through the air, the natural voice of the earth returned. The waves crashed against the base of the white cliffs with a steady, rhythmic rush, pulling the loose pebbles back into the deep with a soft, musical clatter. It was a sound as old as the world itself, a gentle, repeating lullaby that washed over the tired minds of the men standing in the dark. One of the watchers, a man whose hair had turned entirely silver over the course of the long summer, gently lowered his heavy brass binoculars. He let them hang from the leather strap around his neck. He did not need them tonight. He tipped his head back, resting it against the collar of his coat, and simply looked up. Above him, the sky was a dome of flawless, deepest velvet. And scattered across that vast expanse were the stars. They were impossibly bright in the freezing air, shimmering like crushed diamonds scattered on dark glass. For so long, looking up had been an act of necessity, an act of fear. To look up meant to search for danger, to trace the path of destruction, to hold one's breath. But tonight, looking up was an act of pure, exhausted wonder. The watcher traced the familiar, ancient constellations with his eyes. Orion the hunter, standing tall and quiet. The plow, pointing steadily toward the North Star. They were exactly where they had always been. The terrible fires of men had not touched them. The smoke had not dimmed them. They offered a profound, cosmic comfort, a reminder that despite the chaos and the breaking of the world below, there were things that remained eternal, untouchable, and beautifully calm. Miles inland, on the sprawling, grassy airfields, the same starlight fell over the resting machines. The Spitfires and Hurricanes, which had danced with such desperate fury in the heat of the summer sun, now sat quietly on the frozen earth. A delicate, silvery layer of frost had settled over their metal wings and canvas tails, making them gleam softly in the dark. They looked like exhausted, sleeping dragons, their great engines finally cool and silent. A young mechanic, his breath pluming in small, pale clouds in the freezing air, walked slowly down the line of aircraft. He carried a small, shielded torch, but he hardly used it. He knew the shape of these machines by heart. He stopped beside a fighter, reaching out a bare hand to touch the metal of the wing. It was biting cold, but he left his hand there for a long moment. He was not checking for bullet holes or torn canvas. He was simply offering a quiet, physical gesture of gratitude. They had asked the impossible of these machines, and of the boys who flew them, and somehow, they had held the line. He patted the frozen metal, a gentle, sweeping motion, and continued his slow walk under the stars, feeling the quiet peace of the meadow settle deep into his bones. Inside the wooden barracks, the young pilots were experiencing a strange, unfamiliar sensation. They were sleeping. It was not the sudden, black collapse of absolute exhaustion that they had known in August. It was a true, deep, restorative sleep. The cots were pulled close to the small iron stoves, where the embers glowed a soft, cherry red. The room smelled of damp wool, coal smoke, and peppermint. One young boy, scarcely 20 years old, found his eyes fluttering open in the deep hours of the night. He did not wake with a start. He did not reach frantically for his flying helmet. He simply woke up. He lay perfectly still under his heavy blankets, listening. He heard the soft, rhythmic breathing of his friends sleeping in the cots around him. He heard the faint crackle of the stove. And outside, he heard the wind rustling through the bare branches of the trees. He realized, with a slow, blooming warmth in his chest, that he was not afraid. The knot of dread that had lived in his stomach for months had quietly unspooled. He carefully pushed the blankets aside and swung his legs to the floor. He walked in his woolen socks to the small, frost-rimmed window of the hut. He rubbed a tiny circle of clear glass through the ice with the warmth of his thumb and peered out. He saw the frozen grass, he saw the silver wings of the planes, and he saw the stars. He leaned his forehead against the cold glass. A profound, overwhelming wave of gratitude washed over him. It was a gratitude so large and so deep that it brought sudden, quiet tears to his eyes. He was alive. He was breathing the cold night air. The sky belonged to the stars again, and he was here to see it. He walked back to his cot, feeling the solid, reassuring floorboards beneath his feet, and surrendered once more to the gentle, unbroken dark. In the great, battered city of London, the starlight fell on the broken roofs and the swept pavements, turning the mountains of rubble into soft, silvered hills. The sirens had not sounded all evening. The people had eaten their simple suppers, they had drawn their thick blackout curtains, and they had waited. But the mechanical wail never came. The silence stretched on, hour after hour, until it became clear that the night was truly theirs. In a small, terraced house where the front window was boarded over with salvaged wood, a mother and father sat by a meager fire. Their children were asleep upstairs, safe in their own beds, rather than huddled in the damp chill of an iron shelter. The father stood up, moving quietly so as not to disturb the peace of the house. He walked to the back door, turning the brass key, and pulled it open just a few inches. The freezing air rushed into the small kitchen, but he did not close the door. His wife wrapped a knitted shawl around her shoulders and came to stand beside him. Together, they stepped out onto the small, brick-paved patio. The world was entirely dark, stripped of the artificial glow of street lamps and neon signs. It was the kind of darkness that allowed the universe to reveal itself. They looked up at the glittering canopy above the chimney pots. They did not speak. They did not need to. The father reached out and took his wife's hand, his fingers finding hers in the cold. It was a small, fiercely tender gesture. It held the memory of the terrifying nights they had endured, the roaring fires they had fled, and the profound, quiet victory of simply standing together in their own backyard. They breathed in the cold air, feeling it fill their lungs, a sharp, clean reminder of their own vitality. They were tired, an exhaustion that reached down to their very souls, but it was no longer the frantic, desperate exhaustion of survival. It was the heavy, sweet fatigue of a long, terrible labor finally completed. They stood under the stars for a long time, letting the quiet of the night wash over their weary hearts, before turning back into the warmth of their home. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the stars burned their brightest just before fading into the morning, the letters written across the country took on a new, beautiful tone. By the light of a single candle, a young woman sat at her kitchen table. Her handwriting, which had been tight and rushed all summer, was now slow, sweeping, and deliberate. She wrote to her husband, who was stationed on the coast. She wrote, "My darling, if you could only hear the quiet tonight. It is so loud, so beautiful, it almost makes me want to weep. I walked to the end of the lane this evening, and I could hear the owls in the woods again. I saw the stars, and I thought of you standing on the cliffs, looking at the very same sky." She smiled as she dipped her pen back into the inkwell. "I think we might plant a garden in the spring," she wrote. "A real garden, with tall blue delphiniums and sweet peas climbing up the trellis. I am so tired, my love, but it is a good tiredness. The kind of tiredness that comes when you know the storm has passed. I am keeping the fire warm for you. Come home soon." She carefully folded the letter, pressing the crease flat with her thumb. It was no longer a desperate plea against the dark. It was a promise of tomorrow. It was a gentle, quiet declaration that the future was waiting for them, just over the horizon. As the earth continued its slow rotation, turning away from the deep night and inching toward the pale, fragile light of a new day, the island slept. The watchers on the white cliffs took a final sip of lukewarm tea from their thermoses, watching the eastern horizon begin to soften from black to a deep, bruised purple. The young pilots in their wooden huts breathed slowly and evenly, lost in peaceful dreams of ordinary things. The mothers and fathers in the broken city held each other in the dark, their hearts beating in a slow, steady, triumphant rhythm. The battle had asked for everything they had. It had demanded their sleep, their homes, their innocence, and their youth. It had drawn a heavy, jagged scar across the green earth and the blue sky. But as the stars shone down on the chalky cliffs, reflecting faintly in the restless, eternal waters of the channel, they stood as silent witnesses to the unbreakable spirit of the people below. The roaring had faded. The shadows had retreated. The sky had been reclaimed. The people of the island rested under the vast, quiet heavens, wrapped in the profound, exhausted gratitude of simply being alive to feel the night breeze. And as the stars slowly began to fade into the gentle, forgiving light of morning, the weary nation breathed a long, quiet sigh, completely and beautifully at peace. If you kneel down and press your bare hand against the soft, white chalk of the southern cliffs, you can almost feel the earth still breathing a quiet sigh of relief. Time is a gentle, forgiving tide. Decades have rolled over the island since that long, breathless summer, washing away the bitter smoke and the sharp, terrifying echoes of the sirens. The seasons have turned, year after year, laying down thick blankets of autumn leaves, gentle winter snows, and bright spring blossoms. The great, jagged wounds that were torn into the landscape have been slowly, tenderly healed by the persistent grace of nature. If you walk across the southern shires today, beneath a vast and quiet sky, it is almost impossible to imagine the fury that once lived in the air. The sprawling, frantic airfields, once smelling of high-octane fuel and hot engine oil, have returned to the earth. The grass has grown tall and sweet again, swaying in a breeze that carries only the scent of clover and the distant, salty whisper of the sea. The deep craters that once scarred the meadows have softened into shallow, grassy hollows, places where wildflowers gather in the spring, nodding their delicate heads in the sunshine. But the land does not forget. The memory of that summer did not vanish when the last engine fell silent. It simply settled. It seeped deeply into the chalk, into the roots of the great oak trees, and into the very marrow of the countryside. Sometimes, after a heavy spring rain, the earth will offer up a small, rusted reminder of what it holds. A child walking her dog across a plowed field might spot a strange piece of metal half buried in the mud, a tarnished brass button, a broken buckle from a parachute harness, or a single, empty shell casing. She might pick it up, rubbing the dirt away with her thumb, feeling the weight of it in her small hand. She does not know the terror of the day it fell, but as she slips it into her pocket, a profound, silent connection is made. The past reaches out, just for a moment, and touches the present. The echoes of that time do not live in the grand monuments of stone and bronze, though those are beautiful and necessary. The true echoes live in the quiet, intimate spaces of everyday life. They live in the dusty, sunlit attics of old terraced houses, tucked away inside worn leather trunks and cedar boxes. In these quiet spaces, the fragile artifacts of a heartbreaking summer are carefully preserved. Imagine opening one of those boxes today. The air inside smells faintly of dried lavender, old paper, and a time long gone. Beneath a neatly folded woolen uniform, you find a small stack of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. The paper is pale blue, thin and delicate, the edges softened by the countless times it has been held by trembling hands. You untie the ribbon. You unfold the top letter. The ink has faded to a soft, dusky gray, but the looping, hurried handwriting of a 19-year-old boy is still perfectly clear. He writes to his mother, telling her not to worry. He tells her the weather is splendid, that the food is fine, and that he hopes the dog is behaving himself. To read those words now, knowing the unimaginable weight of the sky that boy was carrying on his shoulders, is to feel a sudden, aching lump in the throat. It is a voice whispering from across the decades, carrying a profound, everyday heroism. It is the fierce, protective love of a child trying to shield his family from the dark, captured forever in fading ink. These letters are the true history of that summer, far more vital and true than any textbook or military map. And what of the young women of the auxiliary, the watchers on the cliffs, the mechanics and the dust. Their echoes are there, too, woven into the fabric of the country they saved. When you walk down a busy city street, past the glowing windows of bakeries and the warm, inviting doorways of local pubs, you are walking on ground that was once held together by the sheer, stubborn resilience of ordinary people. The grandmothers who swept the rubble from their front steps are gone now, but their spirit remains. It is there in the quiet determination of a community coming together. It is there in the simple, defiant act of putting the kettle on when things seem too dark to bear. The city was rebuilt not just with brick and mortar, but with the invisible, unbreakable bonds that were forged in the damp, shared spaces of the underground shelters. The people of that summer did not think of themselves as legends. They were just people. They were tired, they were frightened, and they simply wanted to go home, to sit by their own fires, and to listen to the rain without wondering if it was something worse. They did extraordinary things because the moment demanded it, and then, when the storm finally broke, they simply went back to the quiet business of living. They put away their uniforms, they rolled down their sleeves, and they began the long, slow work of building a peaceful world. They raised their children, they tended their gardens, and they grew old with a quiet, dignified grace. But we must also think of the boys who did not get to grow old. The boys who went up into the dazzling, blinding blue and never came back down. They remained suspended in that summer forever, their faces forever young, their laughter forever echoing in the wooden dispersal huts of memory. To them, this quiet night is a whispered lullaby. If you could speak to them now, across the veil of time, what would you say? You would not need to speak of grand victories or strategic turning points. You would only need to tell them to look around. You would tell them that the beaches they look down upon from their freezing cockpits are filled with children building sandcastles in the sun. You would tell them that the merchant ships sail freely across the channel, their running lights glowing warmly in the dark, with no fear of shadows falling from the clouds. You would tell them that the great city they fought to protect is a tapestry of light and life, its streets bustling and its skies completely, wonderfully empty of danger. You would tell them, with a voice full of deep, exhausted gratitude, that they can rest now. The heavy, suffocating weight of the sun that they carried for so long has been lifted. The line they held, when it was nothing but a fragile thread of sheer willpower, did not snap. They gave away all their tomorrows so that the people below could have their todays. It is a gift so massive, so incomprehensibly generous, that it can never truly be repaid. It can only be honored in the quiet moments of peace that they purchased. When the autumn winds sweep across the high hills now, bending the tall grass and rustling the dry leaves of the oak trees, it is easy to imagine it is not just the wind. It is the collective sigh of those who stood in the breach. It is the soft, brushing sound of a silk scarf, the distant, muffled laughter from a canvas tent, the faint, metallic clink of a tea mug set down on a wooden table. They are woven into the wind. They are part of the soft, rolling mist that gathers in the valleys at dawn. They are the guardians of the summer sky, watching over the green earth with a quiet, eternal love. As the night deepens, drawing its heavy, velvet curtain over the island, the great white cliffs stand silently against the dark water. The sea gently laps at the ancient chalk, a rhythmic, soothing heartbeat that has sounded since the dawn of time. Above, the stars begin to reveal themselves, one by one. They are the same stars that the older men of the Observer Corps watched from their cold, sandbagged pits. They are the same stars that offered a moment of breathtaking peace to a young pilot looking out of a frost-rimmed window. They shine down now with a brilliant, indifferent beauty, untouched by the sorrows and the triumphs of the earth below. The long, terrible storm of that fateful summer is over. It has passed into memory, into the faded ink of letters, into the rusted relics in the soil, and into the quiet, proud hearts of the generations that followed. It is time to let the day go. It is time to release the heavy burdens of the past and the anxieties of the future. The sky is clear, the earth is solid and warm beneath you, and the night is entirely safe. Let the gentle, rhythmic sound of the waves washing against the shore carry you away. Let the soft, rustling wind in the trees be a soothing whisper in your ear. The watch has been kept. The line is held. The world is at peace. And as the stars turn slowly in the vast, quiet heavens, you, too, can surrender to the deep, forgiving embrace of the dark, and simply, finally, sleep.